A lot of the front work. So a lot of yeah, you bet. Model the river.
You're not going to share anything like with oily things like that, are you? You're not going to share anything with oily.
I think it's numeric.
Makes sense.
Rich Flanagan is involved. I've worked with him. I don't know if you guys
Two clients. One
Really, you know your general manager.
Oh, yeah.
Very yeah. He probably really appreciates you.
And what about you? Yeah, he hired me.
See, there you go.
RHA, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're all in on that.
I mean, I'm not worried like that.
Yeah, like mathematics.
I am in the wrong field when I challenge people on where the numbers. Like, why am I talking out loud?
Eleanor? Yeah.
Who are you with? What were you doing before you
Came all the way over? So I've been
You're coming from Japan?
Yeah. I started out.
He doesn't know that.
You get the drive job.
Yeah.
4 hours. And then 4 years. Yeah, 4 years.
Andrew.
So he was still the
Thank you. Yeah, let me.
No, Andrew.
For this, Westar Energy before that I was like, I know, right? Here in Colorado. And it hasn't changed a bit. And you see how migrant on it. Right? It's part of the world.
It's really different.
Yeah. Anytime you feel like you need to see something different, it's going to another direction.
Very true.
Yeah, spend a weekend in Pittsburgh. Some luck.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wouldn't.
Getting a little more engaged.
Even with all the challenges. I am also representing Olympic Community Solar. Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, and I know.
Oh, on the corner?
Who had a chance to leave or something, and so he'd get out of it. I want to take a third look. But yeah, we're around.
And then, of course, you're in Kansas. Okay.
Here.
Oh,
They were sitting there.
I mean, I did marry her out. My own I don't want to shoot.
keeping it fresh.
Yeah. A brand new pen. Working on a year. I like your raise.
We did not.
Right.
I know, right?
Yeah, you're like.
You know, storage containers. How do you do these things? Oh, I mean, I think
We decided we had to start attending these in person.
I don't know.
Clockwork.
Along with you.
Sorry, there's no audio, there's no.
Hey.
I only heard every other word. I'm trying to get it missing.
Where did you get the?
And then somebody puts you on hold, and then, somebody inevitably goes, when somebody goes to the restroom.
Good afternoon.
How's it going? Oh, great. I'm covering, but I'm great.
On a Monday.
You did.
What did you get into?
Oh man, we did the October
Okay.
and then this year it was Afraid of the Dark. And the whole and they wait until it's 50 live.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about just coming long
court. You know, you do it a couple of times regularly. Really. So I have very limited like night writing experience. So even though I sit down, like, oh, that's right, Phil's right here. Yeah.
Right.
You know, I forgot about the left person. But okay. Yeah, they are.
Yeah, it should be kind of
No. We had a cougar and he was hanging out by the high school. Like the children to talk about. I almost had a porcupine. Usually they're cattle. You have to walk up,
Yeah.
come around the corner and have a side of beef in your way.
Yeah. You're going fast.
But Durham is fun.
Yeah. A couple weekends ago?
Yeah, it's out of Beacon Hill. And,
Okay.
Have you ridden Beacon?
No, I've never ridden in Spokane at all.
Of course, it's fun.
Pretty good.
They have some fun features.
Very good.
That's challenging. That's kind of problem. Really, that was really got home, things like got everything. Glad was sitting right next to the Saturday. So I went up and got home.
It's never ending. No, it doesn't never end. The same. But my family, I just left I didn't watch it yesterday. I was my dad, how are you? Oh, worry about it. Oh, that's my very
I think on the west side.
I'll be like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
an idea here.
I'm now, like area.
Sometimes they love to do that.
Oh, wow.
Trip them on the right track.
But it was living in that area. I mean, it was just so wet. Parked like entire accident, drove a lot of miles. And it was mud and
A lot of it.
it was just, a sweet adventure ride. Like, I don't know. No,
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you everyone for coming out to the beautiful Wenatchee area for our meeting this morning. We're good on. Okay.
Because I did.
So, my name is Sarah Borfall with the Department of Commerce. I know many of you in the room. So yeah, today we're going to be going through a bunch of steps, as you can see on the agenda. So we want to kind of jump right in. Let me just quickly do some introductions, and we'll have everyone go around the room and do introductions, and then I'll explain how this workshop's going to work. So we have Austin Sharp in the back. That'll be our WebEx DJ. Austin is our new ledge and rules coordinator in the Energy Division, so someone you'll probably be seeing. And then Glenn Blackman, Energy Policy Manager, all of you know. We can just quickly go around and say your name and who you're with, and we'll just quickly go around the room.
Johnny Bosch, Northwest Energy Coalition.
Kent Lopez, Washington Electric Cooperatives.
David Camp, Northwest Renewables.
Eleanor Bastian, Washington Environmental Council.
Dave Warren, contract lobbyist for a variety of clients in renewable fuel and renewable energy and storage.
Kelly Hall with Climate Solutions.
Matthew Hefner, IBEW. Tom Maker, Clark Public Utilities.
Nicholas Garcia, the Washington Public Utility District Association.
Chris Weber, Tacoma Power.
Rennie, Tacoma Power.
It's Snohomish County Public Utility District.
Ian Hunter, Snohomish PUD.
Dave Arwell, I'm also a contract lobbyist. I'm here on behalf of Chelan PUD, the City of Richland, and Energy Northwest.
Kevin Galkey, the Energy Authority.
Julie Hakala, Chelan PUD.
Paul Dietz, Grant County PUD.
Liz Klumpus, Bonneville Power.
Steve Taylor, Palace PUD. Me Barth, Inland Power and Light.
Lion, Chelan PUD.
Ned Pearson, CLC Life.
Chris DeJamian, CT Fusion.
American Clean Energy.
Go ahead.
Tom Burns, State Auditor's Office. Natasha Bond, Power Data Works.
I'm sorry, did I miss? Oh yeah, Austin, can we maybe mute everyone? So folks on the line, unfortunately, there is a bit too much noise, so we're going to have to put you on mute. So just in terms of housekeeping through the day, if you want to ask a question as we're going through or bring comments to the table, you can throw it into the comment box. Austin, is there anything else about how to?
No, I think I have not found a way to use the comment box for making noise.
Okay. That'll great. So we'll know you're there. Fantastic. I think there's a lot on the phone, right? How many we have on the phone, Austin?
We have a fair amount.
Okay. So I think in the interest of yes. Great. So today, as you can see, we have a whole bunch to go through, and a lot of the way this was put together was based on all your public comments. First of all, thank you so much for participating in the process. We really appreciate you showing up and providing input. The way we're going to do this, you can see that we don't have maybe 20 to 25 minutes for each topic. So for today, this is not meant to be an exhaustive conversation or, getting to a conclusion necessarily, but what we really need from you is we're just still doing a lot of thinking about these topics. So we just need input kind of at the most basic level as to, whether or not we should be doing rules on these topics. And if we are going to do rules, what do we need to be thinking about in those rules and getting some more specifics, as specific as you want to be today. So I'll be taking notes as we go. And based on kind of who gave us input, I'll be kind of calling someone to start us into the conversation, and then we'll open it up to the whole room. And then at the end of that, you can see that you had, for each section, there's index cards in front of you. We'll just pause for a minute between topics, and you can write down any clarifying questions you have, any more kind of specific recommendations, right, or anything else you'd like. And then, our final product is eventually going to be the public public comments that we get back from you in about a month or so. So kind of how we've done the last tranche of things, do that similarly today. Does that make sense? going forward? Any clarifying questions about that? And then obviously we'll have Glenn here to jump in if we want to parse anything out. Yeah, so I guess we can go ahead and just jump in. Oh, a couple pieces of housekeeping. Bathrooms are out the door across the lobby and then hang a right. We have water here in this back corner. You will also notice you have mics in front of you on the table. If you are having a side conversation, you don't want to get recorded and forever memorialized on our VITA website, go ahead and press the push button to turn that off, and then you can push it back on if you'd like to speak. So free to do that. So we're going to go ahead and just jump right in because we got a lot to cover today. Oh, and then at the break, I will leave out these Post-it notes. So if there's anything you forget that you really wanted to make sure gets added, we'll put these up and you can kind of just add them, to the, as afterthoughts if you have any. So our first topic is elimination of coal-fired resources by December 31st, 2025. And I'm going to have Johnny Bosch from NWAC go ahead and start off the conversation on this, and then we can just go from there. Johnny.
Yeah. Well, frankly, when we looked at it, we realized most the consumers and utilities probably are just getting told through their EPA contracts in some way. We looked at the reports to see what was there. But in case that was something utilities might think about doing, we thought, yes, there should be reporting to show that they're complying. This is a good question about compliance. We thought it should probably be on an annual basis. We're very open to the easiest way for utilities to report this. If that'd be something that's akin to the bill report, the billings report, or whatever. It's basically that any Washington utility has to show that it's not charging its Washington customers for coal-fired power by 2025 in their access. So we were like, that will probably be something that clearly will report that. Open to discussing how that was done.
Thanks, Johnny.
Okay.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on, first off, if we need a way to be reporting coal-fired resources, and if so, any thoughts?
This is Nicholas Garcia with Bupuda. Question about mandate, because the Act also says that if you enter into a contract for less than a month, you don't know where the resources are coming from. If you ultimately, after the fact, find out it comes from coal, you're not subject to penalties. So I think you need to distinguish between what you're subject, what can be penalized for, and what you can't.
Nicholas, can I add on to that? Paul Deese with Grant County. One concern that we've got is, I understand the statute is saying a month or less, which is okay if you're buying a month ahead. You realize that you may be slightly short and you're buying a block of, say, 25 meg ahead. A lot of the markets, though, are far more liquid when you're buying for like a quarter ahead. So my concern here is we may be unwittingly being exposed to much higher prices and a lot more volatility right during that time period when we have the greatest need. And I don't know if that was the intention. I understand that what we're trying to do is to prevent long-term deals, really, that involve coal specifically or a specified source coal purchase. And we may be unwittingly just allowing market purchases in probably the least volatile and most price effective time period. Typically is your quarter, your prompt quarter.
So if I could just tee off that, Lisa Rennie, Tacoma Power. I know during session this bill was making its way through, we worked to try to get language that would also during the market works group and rulemaking that would cover basically Section 3, so not unspecified purchases in Section 3, also the coal, because you could have situations when, as I think Paul was saying, you might have unspecified purchases more than a month, and that they should be dealt with through some sort of methodology that would deem them correctly and not just deem an unspecified market purchase that could have coal in it as strictly coal. So I think from our perspective, I understand what you're saying, that there needs to be some sort of reporting process, but part of this I don't think could be decided until we go through the market groups process and come up with a methodology for unspecified purchases greater than a month.
So if I could just circle back, I agree with what Lisa said. My point for bringing it up was just that when you actually find out after the fact that you do have coal of this market purchase that was, at least for now, 30 days or less in length, in that situation, you obviously need to report it, but you're not going to be penalized for it. And you need to make a distinction in the, that coal content that isn't complying with the statute and that which is essentially.
The other concern we had was this after the fact accounting. We're not necessarily convinced that our current methods for calculating carbon content is really up to the task of making an explicit determination as to how much of a particular kind of resource we have in any of the electrons that are being used to serve our load. So I'm just curious, is there any concern here about the current methods for calculating carbon content?
We're talking about resources and not carbon content. Where does the power come from?
Well, it's to get to Nicholas's point, it's after the fact. You're buying an unspecified source, and then who is determining how that unspecified source is actually served, and are we comfortable with that process?
This is Glenn.
Time period, right? 30 days or more.
No, I understand what you're saying, but I was asking about something more narrow, I think. And then I was just trying to provide a distinction. When you report, you could very easily report that some of the energy you serve was produced by coal. But it was acquired in such a way that it didn't violate the statute and therefore was not subject to penalty. And a distinction between that versus that portion that was, intentionally or because of a contract that you can't get out of or whatever, didn't meet that standard.
Johnny, I think Lisa again, it comes through a little bit in section 3, where a coal-fired resource is defined in section 2 under definitions, and it's based on what would be in rate. So that's where our concern, or we were concerned that it wasn't specifically if you had a resource, coal resource, but it could, if anything that's being used in your allocation of electricity, which is based on whatever you put into rates, could include unspecified market purchases, and therefore it kind of left us in a confused situation, and that's why we wanted to make sure there was a way to talk about unspecified purchases from the market in the market works group. So I don't know if that helps or not.
This is Glenn Blackman, and I guess I would maybe like to have the conversation back up just a little bit and talk about how utility needs to demonstrate that it hasn't used coal as part of its allocation of electricity. I realize there are more complicated questions that be there if you've got a 15-day contract that's for coal, or if it's a 45-day contract, or a contract where the power is delivered more than 30 days from now. If we could take just a minute and talk about how you would document or demonstrate that, just generally speaking, you're not using coal to serve your customers. What would you envision as being the way to demonstrate that compliance?
Glenn, this is Ian Hunter at Snohomish. That's a good question. I think it's the smart way to approach it. I think utilities from a very high level don't want to be put in a position where they have to prove a negative, where you're going through every transaction that you've done to say, this didn't come from coal, and this didn't come from coal, and this didn't come from coal, for every hour of every day of every megawatt that went to their load. I think that there would need to be something more of an affirmative election to say, I know that I bought coal and I'm reporting that, or I'm attesting that I did not buy any coal, and then that attestation would be subject to audit by the state auditor if the auditor decides that that's something that needs to be done. Maybe a higher level look might be easier than going through utilities transactions hour by hour.
So what I heard there was an attestation. Is it
Potentially
the basic instrument that you would use to demonstrate your compliance?
And if this is Nicholas again, if I could just add to that, for full requirements customers who just buy from BPA, it seems to me that simply saying that all of our power came from BPA and therefore we think we're good, I don't know how a utility that is a full requirements customer would come with this other than saying, we think we did because BPA has got the power to determine where the coal that it buys goes to, what markets it goes to, and we're just going to leave it to them to make that choice.
Well, just for clarity's purpose, this is Liz Klump with Bonneville. Johnny made a comment that the public utilities only have coal in their mix because of Bonneville, and I would argue, not that I'm aware of, we do not buy coal. You're thinking of prior fuel mix reporting process that just assigned net purchases, mix generators throughout the region. So that in no way indicates that we have current bilateral contracts for coal generation. So just for the record. We currently, our current practice, because of the California Air Resource Board policies, is we have an attestation that we provide to them. It's confidential. Department of Commerce gets something similar. It's confidential, but we collect the data, we audit it, and then we send it as an attestation to the two state agencies, primarily to CARB, its regulator, and informational only currently to Department of Commerce. And indeed, we do by market purchases. I think everybody's clear on that. But currently, the market is very unspecified, and it tends to be 3 to 9% of our resource mix.
I mean, kind of to that point, most of the coal generating facilities are already planning to be out by 2025. I mean, most of the retirements have been accelerated in this region. So I guess the question I've got, are we talking about phantom coal? Is this coal that's going to be imported from somewhere well beyond our borders, supposedly, during times when we're buying unspecified power in the marketplace? I'm kind of curious where exactly these electrons will be coming from. And again, it gets to the accuracy of the fuel mix report.
I guess I have a clarifying question to add on to that. We're done writing there. Yeah, tell me maybe with Clark Public Utilities. So the language reads, for the purposes of setting electricity rates, which is a forecast basis, usually on an annual projection for setting rates. And I'm hearing we're going to do after the fact accounting on where the power came from. So that's confused as to whether we should be doing that or not, or am I seeing that correctly? Certainly, we're not planning on buying any coal plants or output from coals for rates or for our own future needs, but
and so we will be complying with that.
specifically, but if we have something that happens where we have to buy power and it happens to come from a coal plant, I don't know how this would apply.
So this is what, so that's why, we think of ourselves as a mini Bonneville. We have our own resources. We have the Bonneville contract, but we're in the market. Trying to, do the best with the resources that we have. So, in addition to, yes, there is a carve out for market transactions for a 1 month duration. But anything beyond that, and including, I would think, ultimately even getting into centralized markets, you might have different kind of products that could fall into that unspecified category, which, I'm going back to the whole market works group, I think the idea there was to try to tackle some of these more confusing situations that are market-based rather than actual resource or contract-based. That's where we're coming from.
And this is the Lake Alliance, which led to the, along those lines, I think, I'm just thinking out loud, so this may be a bad idea, but within that market group, I think there could be a discussion about the current product definition of the Schedule C product. So, I mean, if coal's pretty much going to not be part of the mix anyway by then, it could be and I'm using that term carefully, that a product is defined to say no coal. And as long as you're purchasing and selling that product, and you would be able to sign the attestation at the end of the year because you would be able to say, I traded Schedule C and it explicitly says no coal. That's me thinking out loud, and probably deserves a little more follow-up. That I think, I think market liquidity is important to all of us. So I would hate to see us do something that's not needed if there's a simple solution.
So what I'm hearing is the net from Delphi Life is that this is premature. So we really should be discussing this with marketing group. And I guess I'm calling Alex's group on that.
Yeah, this is Dave Warren. It's for Douglas PUD. It is 5 years out. I have a whole lot of shutting down, and I thought the original intent of this was you would divest yourself of your ownership shares or direct contracts, purchasing power from a coal plant. And I think seems like if we try and get into the weeds on reaching through on unspecified powered market purchases, we're going to get into a quagmire of record keeping and audit trails and all sorts of complications. I guess my suggestion would be, can we wait a couple of years on this? Kind of see how this develops, because we are shutting down a whole lot of coal resources in those 5 years. We've got the markets group, and some very deep complexities if you try and go into tracking electrons out of the power pool or it seems like it's one way we could get wrapped around the axle, or another way we could make this real clean and follow the intent and see how much coal is left in 5 years. It would actually be normally coming into the state.
And I think Oregon's going to have to wrestle with this issue as well, right?
Yeah.
As far as how they deal with market purchases and things. Maybe not exactly the same, but it does seem like our preference would be there be some alignment about the product that's traded in the market. And so we would want to make sure that that wasn't different in Washington versus Oregon even.
This is Kelly. I agree that some sort of compliance mechanism is necessary. I do think it's worth separating out market purchase issue with direct contract issue. I think most of the publics rely on, don't have direct contracts. There are a few utilities that I don't really know where all of your energy is coming from. Grant PUD being one of them, just because you have the relationship with Shell. And so I don't know that there's any coal in there, but if there were a public utility with some sort of direct contract, I do think that that's worth separating the rules out on how utilities comply with each of those.
So the two main things that I take away from this so far is the idea that it should be based on attestation, and that it should be focused on direct contracts, or the contract itself says that it's coal, and it's executed. So does that seem like a reasonable way to approach rule language as on an annual basis?
And public?
Each year, looking back at the previous year, that kind of thing.
I think we would only just add to that, it probably should be public and available to the public on your website or something like that.
The attestation.
Before the year or after the year?
I think maybe after the year, but what do you think?
I mean, that's not what it says. It's for rate setting purposes. You set rates prior to the year.
So are you thinking at the time it's more of a commitment that 2020, I promise I will not enter into a contract?
And look at my budget, and look at all my resources, and see where I'm planning everything to come from.
Your IRP, your,
IRP and all those things. And that, you know, I think was more along the lines of, you know, no long-term commitments or yearly commitments or even 6-month commitments. It'll show up in your budget setting process. I think going to an after the fact opens the door for a lot of, I don't know, I would say confusion.
But on that, even if you're planning, I'm just thinking out loud here, I mean, that doesn't mean that you're not necessarily still collecting money on, I mean, that this gets back to the question of, is it, I think that addresses the issue of an actual contract, but doesn't address the issue of market purchases. So that would, if we separate them out then.
Generally speaking, when you plan for where you're going to get all your power from, and some of that will be market purchases, most likely. As you won't ever, most utilities don't have enough internal resources. They can meet 100% of their load, 100% of their time. Sometimes they're going to have too much, sometimes too little. They're going to end up still keep buying and selling. So even if you plan, most likely that planning document's meant to say market purchases, and it may be 1%, maybe 10%.
but you can't know.
But you can't know because of, a lot of it depends upon weather, load, things like that. It's a plan. It's not a commitment.
Right, but that's where I guess I'm a little confused by the point you're bringing up, because I get you're looking forward, you're setting your rates, you're saying we just make these assumptions. At the end of the year, you look back and say, well, in that market purchase, we ended up buying 6 months worth of coal. That's what we want to see you report.
Could I make a suggestion on, and I see that, but it would have to be a contract, right? So at the first year, we can say, here's our resource mix.
Right.
I mean, we all know after 2025, we're not buying coal, either on contract or ownership, right? And if for some reason during that year, you have to sign a 60-day contract directly with a coal resource, and after the fact, you're going to have to own up, right? But you know, going in, that's really not, that's a non-starter. Right. So then the rest becomes sort of unspecified sources. My suggestion is, can we wait till 2023 or 2024 so we can kind of understand what that market may look like in 2025? Because there may not be resources out there selling into a you know, short-term market.
But practical thing is that usually coal doesn't want to sell in the short-term markets. They can't ramp up and down, but not out there.
Right, and they know we're not out signing contracts for 6 months or 60 days, or, you know, it's just power traders and marketers are going to know that. So if so, there's a penalty attached to it, and, you know, you have to look at if that's the only resource available. And
I wouldn't want my utility to look like it's out of compliance because of something that happened after the fact or after our budget or our rate setting processes. And that's where the difference is. Yeah.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
I mean, I get what you're saying, but I'm just saying it's more of a
I mean, we're
look back like that.
After you report all the stuff we use, absolutely.
I mean, presumably, if we do that, it's going to be a reliability issue anyway. It's going to be sort of an urgent crisis if we're going out signing longer than a 30-day contract directly with a coal resource. You know, if we had an earthquake, or who knows what happens, but it just seems like on practical terms, we all know from January 1, 2026, our resource mix is going to change, and we're going to have 5 years to plan for that.
I want to pause for a minute and see if there's anyone online that has anything they'd like to add. Maybe we could unmute just for a second to see if anyone wants to speak up in case they're called in and aren't able to access the comment box.
Get out of the
Austin's doing that. Does anyone want to bring anything else to the table? Does anyone online want to bring anything to the conversation? We've unmuted all of you, so feel free to just speak up. Oh boy, now we're going to mute you again because the feedback is quite bad. Please feel free to send a comment to Austin. And why don't we pause here, unless there's anything else that, Glenn, did you want to throw anything else out there?
No. Good.
One more.
Thank you.
Look around the room. All right, why don't we take a minute? Go ahead and write anything down if you'd like. I'll put these up to look at, and I promise to get better at the note-taking organization.
Quick question for Glenn then. So you kind of framed the construct of that. I mean, that sounds like it's pretty close to what would work. Is that, I guess, or?
It looks pretty good to me, the way Sarah wrote it up there. Close enough.
Does everyone know what that word
Sound it out, right?
We all pretend it.
I'll take this moment just to remind everyone that if you don't have a shining green light on your mic, you won't be able to be heard by anybody outside, which you should be able to leave them on unless you're doing a lot of ruffling papers on top of the microphone. So just before you speak, turn that mic on. Thank you.
All right, so everyone just take a minute and then.
So if you have any, what Sarah was saying was, if you have any kind of final thoughts as you move into final reflection on this topic, you can write them down on one of these cards and we'll collect them afterwards. So, any residual concerns, you could write them down, or if you thought smiley faces are always welcome.
What did you say about
So Glenn, I do have a question kind of based after the fact, because it was recommended, I think by Dave, that maybe this is one of those issues that's not quite right for thinking at this time because of the developments that will happen down the road. Is in your mind, is a legitimate comment, just what Dave said, so look, this is just not ready to have a rule and we should just hold off rather than say, do X, Y, and Z, but just say, wait for a couple of years. Is that a reasonable?
I think it's perfectly reasonable to say we think you should wait about doing anything. Say, I agree with Dave, that's going to be confusing. We've got several Daves here, so give his full name.
Okay. No, okay.
It's a dangerous thing to say anyway.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to say, if somebody wrote that in, they'd be lying.
I had trouble getting it out. I just imagined another day.
Don't look that way.
That didn't help me, sorry.
Are we okay?
And then we also had a request actually from the audience, or the people that are participating online, to mute your microphones when you're not speaking.
Apparently, that hasn't been flipping of the papers is. Better mic, indeed. All right, so we'll just move right along to documentation of non-emitting electric generation. And we'll start with Tatiana from Public Generating Pool from the phone. So, you there?
maybe? Okay, we're unmuted, so feel free to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Well, we submitted comments and included this as a topic area that we thought we would benefit from commerce action. I think the main issue associated with this topic is that non-emitting electric generation doesn't create a REC. And so the question is, how do you track it? And we don't have an answer, but we thought a good process would be perhaps to work with BPA due to the Columbia Generating Station nuclear energy and come up with some sort of solution that we bring back to the larger group. And another issue I think associated with that is the timing. I think similar to the coal-fired generation issue, you know, I don't know, does this just need to be done by 2030, or is there a need to have a solution on this at some date and time before 2030? That would be another question I would have with no answers to that. Does that tee it up adequately, or?
Right. Hi, Dave Harbaugh on behalf of Energy Northwest. That was basically our message too. I think, you know, we need a little bit more time to think through this, and it seems like working with Bonneville and others, we might be able to articulate a pretty clear recommendation. But I don't have one today.
I did have a question.
It's now adopting similar type standards that something around like a zero emission credit or some sort of tracking system would become, it seems like it would be easier to work within, you know, a larger context, given that there are multiple jurisdictions within the whole WEC that have already made a similar commitment. Do you know if they plan on creating some sort of mechanism like that?
This is Glenn Blackman. Regis would, I think, be willing to develop an instrument like that. But the discussions that took place during the legislative session, I mean, it seemed like a conscious decision not to use a tradable credit like this for nuclear. So, you know, my impression is that given the statute the way it is, we need to come up with a solution that at least it wouldn't use this, you know, a statutorily defined credit or certificate. It's possible that the, you know, the compliance could involve some sort of certificate that is issued and confirmed by the generating unit in the same way renewable energy credit is. So that, but not that.
That since it had to be from the statute used the same year that was generated, we were thinking more in terms of the bookkeeping process. We didn't have a distinct answer, but there had to be a way to show how much was produced and the documentation that would go with that, whether it was how it was sold and who bought it, and then someone did something to hold it up at the end and make sure they all matched. But it wasn't anything much more complicated than that.
This is Melissa Lyons from Chelan PUD, and it seems anytime we've had a REC transaction where something wasn't tracked in Regis, we naturally defaulted to an attestation. So it seems like a simple solution for this would just be to require some attestation. So if I bought from CGS, then they would have to deliver the attestation. So not only the energy, but an attestation for compliance.
Do you buy directly or do you buy through CGA?
we've never bought directly from them. It would be embedded in a market purchase, unspecified market purchase.
I believe is the only
of the output, and that we have net billing agreements with every Washington utility that originally signed up for whatever Energy Northwest was in its original days. Yeah, it's a joint operating agency in Washington. I'm guessing most or all public utilities. I don't know. I don't assume that private. They all signed on. And then back in the 70s, Bonneville took on that commitment. I'm not saying it could never change, but right now it's a pretty simple piece of math. So that basically comes from BPA, you're saying?
It comes from Bonneville throughout it goes, and a piece of it goes in every megawatt hour we sell.
Okay.
So, this is Nicholas. Just following up on Liz's comment, it seems to me that, especially for the small requirements customers, that all their power comes from BPA, and BPA says that 6.2% or 150 megawatt hours went to utility A and 10,002 went to utility B. If that should be satisfactory for compliance purposes. It's the information we're getting from BPA, we just package it and send it to Commerce, and that should be sufficient. Because we don't have any way of edit, we don't have any way to kind of check the books or any of that. It's just, that's what we're told.
So to that end, where BPA is involved, you really just make it a single attestation that if you have any questions, ask Elliot.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Well, as long as it's public and people can find it. I mean, that's one of the things for us that's the principle on all these things, that this information needs to be available to the public so they can see it too. So however you do it, we just want to know that it's public.
Tom Haymaker, Clark Public Utilities. And as for other resources, most of your publicly owned resources have bond covenants on it that require you to bring that to load, or you can't use tax-free financing. And so those utilities who have those kind of assets are already tracking and archiving how they're bringing those resources to load. An attestation and data backing it up seems like it would be a reasonable way to go there as well. I think the utility would be able to produce the data pretty quickly.
Sure. This is Glenn Blackman, and it seems like this is sort of the flip side of the coal one, where with coal, trying to figure out how to show that you didn't use it, and with non-emitting, we're trying to figure out how to show how much you did use so that you can count it toward your 100% target. And it also sounds like all of this will involve power that's marketed by Bonneville, unless somebody comes up with another nuclear scenario that we should think about. So the idea that Bonneville customers would figure something out with Bonneville, promising to me.
This is Steve from Cowlitz. So does anybody in this room have any separate bilateral contracts with a nuclear generator? Is that typical?
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anybody thinking about them?
Yeah, I think that's all modular.
Modular would be the only one that you might have in the future outside of Bonneville. And that's a big line.
Yeah, that Idaho.
And that would need to be a way of a test. Yeah.
No,
Other than Bonneville.
it's not impossible. Not at all.
Paul Dietz with Grant. A couple other questions with this cover pump storage. that are in maybe in a closed loop pump storage system, would it also cover battery output? So
You're asking whether those are forms of non-emitting generation.
On that question, because there's a more deeper dive. I appreciate it. In a conversation, but I've always assumed non-emitting is just.
Well, it's really.
That's why I asked the question, because I got the sense that everyone is assuming that.
It was the code for that. But I mean, it basically says it's not emitting if in the moment of generation of power, it doesn't emit carbon. So that's a little, it's in the definition section. It's not a renewable.
I believe pump storage is defined in the definition. Yeah, definitely.
I think that's under hydro with other renewables. So that's where that would be.
Okay, even a closed loop pump hydro, as opposed to, because I thought they were talking about water that was naturally flowing as opposed to one that's in a closed system. Just wanted to make sure that.
That's
the definition of it's non-emitting electric generation, which means electricity from a generating facility or a resource. So if you consider electricity coming from battery storage or pumped hydro, that is a different resource went into it. I do think that's, I don't know if it's a good conversation for it right now, but with regards to how you document non-emitting resources, I think that is something that this group needs to talk about.
Yeah, I think it'll also go to the REC discussion, which is why we're hoping to bring it up.
And just technical point, but just keep in mind that the pump hydro or batteries, that power originally came from something else. And so unless you're keeping it over a compliance period, over the end and beginning of a new compliance period, it will be attributed prior to that through the actual generation of the power. Generation.
I think that's not necessarily a given, Nicholas. I think it bears a whole lot. I represent the Goldendale Pump Storage Project too. So I think that the transformation of a pure energy product to an energy plus capacity project or product, there's a little more discussion.
Well, no, I'd be happy to discuss it, but it started off as pure energy. It was turned into electricity, then it's turned into some sort of battery. It's some sort of spin battery or a hydro,
and then it's regenerated,
whatever.
Right.
But it started off as pure energy.
I just think that I go back and remind everybody that the definition is non-emitting electric generation.
Right.
So that's where you start with, and then we can talk about those others as other categories.
Well, right, but it says electricity from a generating facility or other resource. And so if you have
but the following qualifiers at the end of that, which says that, and that does not emit greenhouse gases as a byproduct of energy generation. That's the last line in that. And I think that's the qualifier.
So, and I could make the case that a battery might be a different megawatt hour than hydro, a megawatt hour out of a pump storage hydro. Maybe, I don't know.
Battery or pump storage.
Yeah, they both store and convert and both lose some energy in the conversion and become dispatchable, become in essence a capacity resource, but then the resulting megawatt hour may have a different quality. Under definition.
I do think this is a bigger topic for possibly another day because one might think of a lot of the existing hydro facilities as battery storage in addition to whatever else they do. And I feel like the hydro operators are going to be held very accountable for what generation is used to power our batteries. And it just seems to be that whatever power generation is used to charge an actual battery or a pump storage project also ought to matter. So the source generator, if it's fossil fuels, it ought to be getting tracked. And I'm not actually sure that's the case in the law as written.
We had this conversation, Nate might remember this at one of the PSC IRP meetings, and the folks who were doing the pump storage project are looking at the one, I think at Goldendale were there, and they said, anything we would use as energy to pump that storage would come from the same clean power that's required by the bill.
Well,
you know, so I'm saying that.
I'm not sure the bill actually requires that out of pump storage.
So I am going to just maybe put a pin in this as legit.
Yeah,
I put it on to the newly formed bike rack, which is the non-fossil fuel. So it is here, Glenn is taking notes.
Good job.
It sounds like there's a lot more to keep out there. I do want to take a second and go to the phones and see if there's anyone maybe we could unmute for a second. So we can go to the phones real quick. Is there anyone that wants to add anything to this conversation? Austin will unmute you now. Y'all unmuted, so feel free to speak up if you want to add anything. Okay. Then we'll remute you for now, but again, feel free to put anything in comments. Anything else going back to some of the comments, the questions we were having from the beginning here about how to create and track, like what's the right mechanism to be tracking these non-emitting resources? That seems to be kind of being talked about. EPA, our customers getting some time to think about that together. Does anyone else want to add anything to this other conversation?
Question for the sake of clarity. What is a cogeneration facility where you may have carbon emissions that result from, say, an industrial process, but they're not emissions that exist but for the, say, heat recapture as part of it? So if you're capturing waste heat and generating electricity with that, your waste heat is not inherently, it's not a net increase in carbon emissions.
That's a really good example of non-carbon emitting generations. And all that happens is actually, it's definitely going along the lines of like paying an outbound truck, being more efficient, 3.5 times, tracking as much energy and But working off that argument, anything coming off of the HRSG unit on a combined cycle would technically be non-emitting.
The question for the group, would that be a thermal track? Or not?
It definitely is thermal, but it would be but it would be non-emitting. It's
Thermal renewable energy credit means with respect to facility that generates electricity using biomass energy. Well, that's strictly biomass, I guess. Thermal energy for a secondary purpose.
So
coming from biomass.
This is Glenn Blackman, and to Dave's point, our question to the Energy Independence Act, you can count efficiency through combined heat and power, the conservation resource. So that may be what you're thinking about. I'm not sure. And the thermal rec, that if you're producing both electricity and useful thermal heat or thermal energy, you can collect a rec for that useful thermal on the same ETU equivalent basis. And then this other part about waste heat being used for electricity, I think we need to look at that on that same bike rack item and see if there's something there besides just the nuclear point or question. Good one.
All right. Well, we're about time for this section. So why doesn't everyone take a moment and put any notes on note cards they would like to pass over here? And then we'll just take a minute for that and then move on to the next topic.
They're related to
So he wasn't cheating. He wasn't. She was.
Here, it's your head.
Well, you're keeping us right on time.
That's good because I'm leaving at 4:30. You've got a long ways to go.
So just my
Wait, you said you were just going to North Bend.
That's a long way.
All right. Let us hop into the next topic,
In there that is just
which is very hard to see underneath this
right off the interstate.
TV. Okay. So public interest requirements under the greenhouse gas neutral standards. And so we're going to start on the phone. So Austin, if you could unmute Derek Gruen from Front and Centered, will kick us off on this conversation. Okay, great. So Derek, you should be unmuted if you want to hop in. Oh, he doesn't have a mic. Sorry, I misunderstood. Okay. Well, why can't he talk on the phone? Is he on the phone or? I see. Eric, if you're there, go ahead and send us a message, but maybe I can turn then to someone else.
Kelly.
Kelly, if you want to jump in and kind of just start us off on this conversation. Oh, sorry, Derek, are you there? Okay, well, hopefully Derek can hear me, and if you can hear me,
We can't hear you.
we can't hear you. Feel free, you can send me an email if you want, and then we can kind of figure it out from there. We're going to go ahead and have Kelly hop in and get us going on this conversation. This would be our on a schedule. So Kelly, why don't you hop in?
Sure. So, the public is language that commonly referred to as, ensuring that all customers are benefiting from the transition. And it has a few different components around equitable distribution of energy and non-energy benefits, reduction of burdens for vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities, incorporating long and short-term public health and environmental benefits, reduction of cost and risk, and then energy security and resiliency. I think we spend a lot of time thinking at this point about how utilities are to incorporate these concepts into planning and procurement. The question is, retrospectively, how do you go back and demonstrate compliance that that's actually been done and that those benefiting from this transition, what does that look like from a compliance perspective?
Thank you, Kelly.
My guys have thought about this. This is Kent with the electric co-ops. My guys have thought about this, and we have absolutely no ideas.
With some party.
Yeah.
It hasn't been very long now.
Yeah, well, hey, come on. It's the co-op guys. They don't have to think that long. No, this really baffled them.
Okay.
Other utilities, I'm curious, actually feeling similarly, like that it's been brought up. Has it been brought up? Has it been talked about? And if so, have you ever been any ideas?
This is Paul Dees with Grant County.
Mike Paul.
Paul Dees with Grant County. This is something that's already been built into our rate structure. It's a part and parcel to what Grant County does. We have a set of preference customers who enjoy power at rates that are typically below marginal cost, and it's entirely to address some of these issues. So we feel that you can address this through your rate structures and just make it explicit. The other way of the concept of resilience, a lot of that has to do with you have projects that possibly can bolster the resiliency of your transmission and distribution system. That's something else that we're already addressing. It's part of what it means to be a Grant County citizen, and it's part of the expectation of our process and direct result of the elections process and the fact that we have elected officials who are responsive to the people of Grant County.
And this is Kent again, and that's sort of where my
co-op guys were coming from, in that the nature of the co-op utility is that everybody who's buying electricity from the co-op, is a member of it. So their board of directors are all members as well. They're all customers. And so, it's this process of when they set their rates and so forth, it's all based on what's best out there for the individual customers or the customer groups, what's best for them. And so they're trying to figure out what's different there. And Andy, you're a co-op guy, so you probably attest to that. You're probably a little closer to it than I am.
Yeah, we're actually in the process of the rates right now, and that's a conversation that the Board of Trustees is having, is we thought we were doing this. So I think that it's more of a nervous thing, like, we have to do anything more, were we already ahead of the game on this? That's exactly actually what our board has been asking. And so I think that's where the confusion and the lack of ideas on the co-op side coming from is, as far as we can tell, we're already doing it.
I've worked pretty closely with co-ops in the Midwest, and a lot of times the folks who are most at risk in rural communities tend to be the smaller towns, the ones with the much older wires. A lot of the co-ops, and I'm thinking specifically Sunflower Co-op in Kansas and others in the region, are focusing on these at-risk communities. So it's something that we do well. Yeah, I think the IOUs maybe have a lot more to do in that field than the publics, generally speaking.
In some ways, this is Johnny Bosch. In some ways, part of this might be simpler than we're making it sound, because it's making sure that all customers are benefiting. And one of the reasons that low-income and vulnerable customers were included in the first place is that we were looking for something much more intentional. A lot of vulnerable communities have suffered the brunt of fossil fuel development, processing, transportation, and it's burning, quite frankly, especially, say, folks along freeways, for example, a quick example. So I think some of this is just saying, if you're going to be doing, for example, solar energy, you might want to make sure that you can say, we have a carve-out, perhaps for very low income, to make sure that they get to benefit as well from, say, a community solar project. I'm just trying to think of something that's a simple example of that. I think the rates, but there may be some narrative behind that rates that explains more of what you're doing, a listing maybe of measures taken, that if you're ensuring more resiliency, that it was, that who benefited from it. And I'm sorry, Derek's not on to explain this because he does this better than I do, but I think that some of it, EPA recently came out with some measures that show reductions in burning of some fuels actually has a reduction in criteria pollutants, not just carbon. So those reductions in criteria pollutants result in health benefits. So those would probably show up in those neighborhoods that are most impacted. So that's another way to show that, everyone is benefiting from measures and not just moving ahead.
So I guess I struggle with what you just said, because I have been asked many times by various entities that say, well, what are the benefits we're supposed to show? Because, we're not generating our own electricity. It's going to happen at some other place. Our costs are going to go up. What can I do to show that there's an equitable distribution of benefits when I can't even figure out what the benefits are?
Well, if they were looking like at a microgrid.
I'm sorry?
Well, if you're looking at establishing microgrids in your service area, making sure that they are in all kinds of neighborhoods.
This is John Cummins. That doesn't necessarily apply to the clean energy standards.
Yeah, it doesn't.
And so it's not just, it's specific to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities, which are going to be identified in this new tool that's being developed. And so it's not about, as I read it, it's not about just making sure everybody is getting access to solar. It is, how are you targeting those specific identified census tracts that are coming up as highly impacted communities in this analysis. And most of our thermal generation is not even in Washington. of, and those impacted communities are probably impacted because they live on heavily traveled transportation corridors, which which is hard to affect impacts to those communities when the source of their impact is not related to electrification.
So I believe we have Derek on the phone. He should be unmuted. So Derek, do we have you? He should be unmuted.
You're not muted, right, Derek, on your, whatever you're talking on?
Speak up.
I think you're there, but you're very quiet.
Can't hear me?
Oh, you're breaking up, I think is what it is.
The phone?
Oh.
Yep, there you are. I hear you.
Well, I'll just try. I think, the work that utilities are doing around rates and trying to keep universally rates low is a great element to this, but by my read, I think there's a additional piece requested about energy and non-energy benefits and the distribution to different groups. Look at that through geographics, as I think he was pointing to in terms of where impacts might be related to siting infrastructure, but also demographics of who's benefiting from visions. And I think there's a way to think about this about the organization, the energy and implementation side, but also the organization itself, in terms of what types of programs you're offering around conservation, contracting and purchasing decisions. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, as the utilities as well as commerce, there's a need to define that and provide some clear boundaries. So more work to do, but I think it
Were we able to get that in the room, or would we like to have Derek say that one more time and a little bit louder? Yeah, we got about every other word. Could you summarize that quick for us, Derek, a little louder?
There are a lot of decisions being made. Chance to evaluate those against equity criteria. We should be looking at that and providing clear direction as a part of compliance.
Thanks,
Good,
Derek.
yeah, thank you.
Kelly, go.
So this is Kelly. I mean, I do think a lot of this will depend on what sort of guidance Commerce and, the UTC as well provide on how to incorporate this into planning and procurement. But I think once we have agreements or are all dissatisfied with those rules, however they do get incorporated, I think that then is when we need to start thinking about, well, how do we look back then, after a couple of years to make sure that it's working and to make sure we're actually seeing outcomes that the law intended. But I do think this is heavily related to what kind of guidance we can all come up with for how to incorporate all these concepts into planning.
So, Johnny and Derek, just a follow-up question on this topic. How do you, I understand you're kind of looking at a way to look back to see what kind of progress is being achieved. So given that CETA also includes the low-income reporting and planning and targeting provisions, and then there's the cumulative analysis, which will be, I think, a tool that'll help be more specific for utilities that don't have a clear understanding maybe where emissions are most concentrated in their service areas, figure that out. So two other rulemakings and processes that kind of get at the heart of this in terms of at least electricity delivery.
Yeah, I think this kind of gets what Derek was talking about, though, that this isn't just energy benefits, these are the non-energy benefits as well. And so I think the cumulative impacts analysis will identify who those communities are, but not necessarily provide guidance on how utilities go about then incorporating these concepts into them. So I think that they're related, absolutely, but I do think they're slightly separate.
I really kind of hate to bring this up, but I'm just going to say it anyway. It gets really, for I think utilities, a little unclear when you start to go into the non-energy benefits as separate, because it doesn't have a direct nexus to the actual electricity that's being used to serve customers. So just flag that when you go into non-energy benefits, for instance. Yes, we can invest in electrification transportation, and that is, you know, I mean, at least that's what our legal counsel says. That's something we can do, helps our ratepayers because we're getting a more retail load. It, you know, provides benefits, but we have to make a business case for that, and we can't claim reducing air particulates and other, you know, from transportation, not say our business case for using ratepayer money for that kind of purpose. So if you look at all the Okeson decisions that required a nexus to the electricity, that, I mean, I think this is great, I know what we're doing. It's just, I think, I want to make sure that everyone's mindful about that utility nexus. Electric utility nexus.
Right, and I think one example of that might be then, you can go out and plant chargers everywhere for electric vehicles, but shouldn't you also be doing electric buses for those who can't afford cars or you know, live in neighborhoods? I think that's the kind of making sure everyone's, because the language in 4.8 does say everyone is benefiting. So it's not just, you know, did the Tesla owners get taken care of, but did the people who ride the bus get taken care of too? That's, I think your example works there.
But I think our IRPs, given that those two other processes and even electric transportation things get reflected in the IRP, I think that gives you a good sense of what's going on in the utility in terms of what they're doing.
And Lisa, I should clarify that just when I'm thinking about non-energy benefits, I'm thinking about things that are still related to energy. So, for example, like this requires you to incorporate the social cost of carbon. That's one way of taking carbon into account that is an energy benefit, but also a non-energy benefit. And I think conservation assessments are similar in that you get the 10% adder to incorporate them. Yeah, and so I think very similar to the way a utility operates now, but just having that.
Can folks hear me? This is Sean, Energy Project.
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. Just want to add to the conversation here briefly. The way that the Energy Project is looking at this in terms of any investments that utilities are making, you know, particularly with some consumer-owned utilities looking at battery backups, PV investments. We're talking about electric vehicles here. When decisions are made to make investments in that, in those respects, we see this specific language addressing the need to evaluate how those benefits are flowing and to make special considerations for being able to include populations who may not be able to directly benefit. So, for example, as was mentioned, carve out, for example, in projects similar to like what Snohomish PUD did with their recent investment. And so this is not necessarily speaking to the energy benefits, but we're looking directly at investments utilities are making and evaluate sort of how equitable those are and whether or not they're including benefits that for vulnerable or highly impacted communities.
Lisa Grant, a question for everyone. Since we're talking about investments, is it possible for us to expand the definition of benefits? And I'm specifically thinking about the many times we've been in competition with other utilities trying to get people who want to build their facilities in Grant County. They're looking at us because maybe power is the primary marginal cost component in their production. They select us because we have cheapest power. And the economic benefit oftentimes comes in the form of jobs. And that's a form of investment that we have, which is not spending money, which is reducing our overall rates, producing a least cost solution so that people can build their factories in our county. I'm just curious if there's room in the rulemaking process that we would get credit for that kind of behavior as well.
Feels like it'd be like I know the answer, but I don't.
Wait, that would be documentation of who you end up hiring. I mean, if we run into this obviously in Seattle a lot, jobs come in and then people who are highly educated, poor people get those jobs. And so how do you say everybody's benefited from that? Because I think that's what, and Sean, I'm going to speak for you, so correct me if I'm wrong. think they're really looking at that element of equity.
No, I get totally what you're saying. We have 85,000 people in the county, and we're talking about food processing jobs. We're talking about jobs at even the data service centers. We're talking about not necessarily high-paying jobs. A lot of times these are entry-level jobs. These are rock-solid jobs specifically targeted to folks who are, not necessarily college educated. I mean, this is just an example of what we're wanting to be compliant completely.
Right.
But it's like, we're not really looking at an urban environment. We really don't have a lot of college-educated professionals coming in and demanding power. So, I mean, it's a different situation.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that because I agree. I mean, it seems to me that the one way you can guarantee that everyone benefits is when you have really low rates, because everyone gets low rates. Once you start saying, well, now we're going to have to take other investments, that means that those costs are going to be transferred to ratepayers. They don't just disappear. They transfer to ratepayers, and ratepayers bear them. And I hear a lot of talk about investments that we should make either in electrifying vehicles or electrifying buses or microgrids or whatever. Those are expensive. Those are not inexpensive actions, and those costs are going to be reflected in rates to the customers. And, one of the things that has been mentioned is we do cost-benefit analysis. So we have to demonstrate that the benefit of whatever we're doing is, provides reasonable benefit. Whatever costs that we're doing provides reasonable benefits. And, it's easy to say, well, you should do X or Y, but, if you look into rural communities, some of them have 10, 20 electric vehicles in the entire county. And, putting out 25 electric vehicle chargers isn't going to make a difference in the number of vehicles out there, because the problem is that people aren't buying them because they can't afford them or for other reasons. So I just want everyone to remember that the investments you're talking about are going to come back, and they're going to be a cost to everybody.
And yeah, this is Sean with the Energy Project here. Just want to speak to that. And certainly, the legislation does speak to energy burden. So I mean, in addition to low rates, I mean, we're looking at the overall energy burden to customers, which is, I think, an important distinction here. And I think part of compliance will be utilities having programs to reduce that energy burden, whether they're the energy assistance programs for our direct grants, low-income weatherization, engagement in any investment in renewables. And I think it's, certainly there's got to be a business case made for each utility and their investments, whether it's an EV, et cetera. But I think the heart of this is looking at energy burden to customers and ensuring that that is being addressed through specific assistance programs. And in any case where utilities are making investments, that there is an equity filter that examines those investments. And not saying that every utility has to make EV available as a smart decision, but if and when those decisions are made, that those are being evaluated. In addition, I think, to the specific energy assistance programs that this legislation calls out.
Just for clarity, Sean, you're talking about, what you were just talking about is in section 12, right?
Correct. And it was with respect to demonstrating compliance. Yeah, the section 12 there, but correct.
So is the interaction between the two. So there is a section specific to energy burden, but in this section, I think just reiterating a little bit what Sean said, it doesn't take away local context at all. It's about, in addition to doing cost-benefit analysis, doing equity analysis, that gets at questions of distribution. So keeping low is a good kind of universal strategy, but there may be some strategies that need to take into account the differences between populations and impact of different rates on different populations. And in that case, universal rates, for example, may not be the strategy that addresses that.
Matthew Heffner, IBW. Paul, I'd love to continue this conversation. So I'm the benefactor of those jobs there in Grant County and in Douglas County with the data centers. I was an apprentice out there. In fact, my brother-in-law had his first day of his apprenticeship today out there at Rosedin for Sabi Electric. I'm also the city councilman in East Wenatchee. You know, one of the only concerns I have regarding including jobs into that qualifier is we have moratoriums right now with Douglas PUD regarding some of the blockchains and providing no jobs whatsoever. So, I mean, these are servers that people are literally just plugging into the wall or plugging into storage things. So how do we differentiate between, yes, we have to have cheap power, but does that actually equal jobs? So, I mean, there's going to have to, or much less a family wage job. Right. And so this would be a great, I'd love to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's a great example of what Grant County has done, because we've deliberately said, no, this is not what the county's about. And if you want to do your blockchain here, you're going to have some of the highest rates in the county to do that. So, I mean, we're already addressing equity issues in our rate structure. It's just part and parcel to us, which is exactly why I'm asking.
And we're actually just about at time, so I'm going to go ahead and just pause it there. Luckily, we are following this with a break, so we can get up and walk around and talk more. As I mentioned, these will be up, and I'll put some Post-its out. So if there's things you wanted to add that I didn't capture correctly, please do. I also added jobs to the bike rack, as well as some of this more in-depth conversation around non-energy benefits and how to define those. I think really interesting conversation so far. Great. So if everyone just wants to be back here at, do I have this right? 3 o'clock?
3 o'clock, yep.
3 o'clock, right?
That's right, 3 o'clock, yep.
And can everyone do me a favor? If you write cards, can you put what topic number it is? And if you feel up to the task, your name as well, but just so I can understand what you're referring to. Great. Thank you. Our next topic is pursuit of conservation, efficiency, and demand response resources. Kelly, are you going to go ahead and get us started on that? Great.
Different pieces. One is the section that Glenn, you laid out here, that in meeting the standard, you have to pursue all cost-effective, reliable, and feasible conservation, energy efficiency, and demand response. And so the question is, you know, a lot of utilities already have a process for demonstrating cost-effective. Additionally, what does reliable and feasible mean in you know, with regards to this standard in combination with cost-effective? And then utilities that aren't already required to demonstrate that, how are they demonstrating compliance? And then I think the second piece to this question around conservation, efficiency, and demand response is the specific targets the utilities are setting for energy efficiency, demand response, and renewable energy, and how, again, do utilities then demonstrate compliance with those targets that they have set out in clean energy implementation plans. So two slightly different tricks and mechanisms for conservation, energy efficiency, and demand response, but I think both are important for demonstrating compliance with those targets.
And I kind of missed a little bit of the last thing you said. So you mentioned, you know, the reliable and feasible, which they don't really have processes right now. Utilities, and then you can say about today.
Yeah, so in the clean energy implementation plans, utilities have to identify specific targets for efficiency, demand response, and renewable energy. And so after those have been identified, how do we look back retrospectively and make sure that they're utilities are complying, and you know, how are they held accountable for those targets?
Do you want to hop in and think about how we can think about this? Anyone else that would like to build off of the questions that Kelly put out?
I guess I have not subject for this I think we do acquire
Can we have the question repeated back up as a response?
Glenn, can you repeat the question? Sure. So the question was about whether utilities that have fewer than 25,000 customers would be required to comply with this provision about pursuing conservation, efficiency, and demand response. And my understanding is that they will have to do that under this new law, not under the existing law, but all utilities will have to do that.
So, Nicholas Garcia with Fukuda. I guess my understanding of the act would be that if you have less than 25,000 customers, you still have to set targets for conservation and demand response. But the methodologies established in 285.040 aren't applicable.
I wrote that question down on here too. So
I mean, that's the question of what methodology for the smaller one follows.
No, I understand that, but the 040 methodology says you have to determine a 10-year conservation, I don't remember, the target and a 2-year goal, or the other way around. And I don't think that was at all contemplated in this language. Is that you establish an objective, but not the 10 and 2.
So what's the recommendation for our methodologies? It's not that.
No, I at this point, I would argue that it should be left to utilities to determine what's cost effective in their service territory if they have less than 25,000 customers. If they have more, then they are subject to the Energy Independence Act already and have to follow that approach.
think this is Lisa from Tacoma. I think that's generally what we were thinking, that particularly because section, I think it's 4(1)A, it doesn't include demand response, and that, but the targets do under the clean implementation plan. So I think when we looked, initially the way we thought the bill would work is that the energy efficiency and conservation ties directly back to what you're mandated to do under I-937, and you would have to demonstrate that. So our question more is with demand response. We feel like the target, and it says that if the Utilities Governing Board wants to go beyond I-937 set targets, but they're already set for us. So, we have a methodology to set them. But given that that's what we're doing, then that would be the target for each 4-year clean energy implementation plan. Demand response, I feel like, was kind of tacked on. It's really important. It's something Tacoma Power has been looking at seriously. Taken several attempts to come up with different kind of demand response programs, but yet to be able to get any of them fully funded. So it's a nascent area, and I think our experience is that it means different things to different people. It's going to be very specific to different service areas. And it's not defined or mandated anywhere in state law at this point. So that particularly feels like something that should fall into the purview of the local board demand response, and the other is covered through I-937.
So I guess I'll just say that I think that, this goes back to a lot of the conversation that we've had multiple times around how much guidance you provide versus how much flexibility. I do think that, just leaving the complete methodology up to each individual utility, you're going to have over 60 different methodologies. And I think that there is a lot of value in having some consistency in how utilities are thinking about the cost-effective efficiency, conservation, and demand response.
Kelly, so do you see that just relates to demand response, and given that there is a methodology defined for energy efficiency, do you feel that's still unclear for energy efficiency?
Well, there is for you, but there isn't for every utility. So it's new utilities incorporate this. Yeah. So again, I think that when I'm talking about a lot of these things, this goes back to the public interest language as well. There's certainly utilities that are doing it really well. There's some utilities where it's going to be brand new. And so how do we provide enough guidance to make sure it's relatively consistent across the whole thing? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think right today we're talking about compliance. So it's guidance, but then how do we look back and say, yes, you were following through with that guidance, or yes, you were meeting what the guidance actually laid out.
Question for Liz. Does Bonneville still give the criteria for small utilities? I mean, what's the current program for setting conservation targets when Bonneville provides power to? Because all these small utilities are your customers, right?
Yeah. Essentially, we collect revenue from them. They specify in energy and their revenue.
So that's in the context of our programs.
There's one exception, which is Douglas.
Well, not every utility.
Not every utility is a power customer of ours.
Small.
Non-qualifying.
Aren't all the small guys except Douglas their customers?
Probably.
I think so.
Probably, yeah.
So I'm just wondering if that's enough of a framework, is I guess where my question was going.
One of the things that was brought up in the bill and is specifically allowed is that smaller utilities can band together or come together with a
To aggregate.
Aggregate meters, but aggregate to have a official program. So Liz, I don't know how much BPA, how you send out the money now, or how you say you gather it and then you send it out, or that you give it back to utilities to spend. But maybe there's something in there that could also be addressed about the smaller utilities in particular coming together to provide programs? Because I know this is a challenge with size of staff and extent of area served, but maybe combined under the roof of some entity to do that, that would make sense.
I think we assume that for the sake of, this is Kevin Gauke with DEA, that for the sake of defining the cost-effective component, some of this is really speaking to your utility specifically. I'm a summer peaking utility. A demand response, which is primarily deployed in the winter, may mean less to me than it is to somebody who's a winter peaking utility.
That's true.
In light of this, by subdividing out who falls into what category, that we are looking at this solely on the basis of each individual utility, not as the collective state of Washington. Is that a fair assumption? That's the way I would interpret it.
I guess I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but I think each utility needs to come up, I mean, under their IRP, going to be a clean energy action plan, and then there's two, before 2030, there are two clean energy implementation plans, and those will have interim targets getting you to that 80 to 100%, and then specific targets of, to get to that, I'm going to do X amount of renewables, distributed resources, or conservation. So, yeah, renewables too. So I guess the question I'm having is, that I'm asking is, are you proposing something different than that?
No, I'm just making sure that when we look at things, we can define them as whether or not they are or not cost effective. Some of that cost is a function of how that piece, or a specific subset of demand response, into my utility portfolio. Mm-hmm. For a demand response that would primarily deploy in wintertime, or a utility who's summer peaking, that may not be the most cost effective. But that may not be as cost effective as it is for, say, a winter peaking.
Right.
And that would be taken into consideration. Right. Is that a fair assessment?
Right, because it will be cost effective for each utility.
Right.
Quick question. Sorry, go ahead.
So actually, this is Nicholas. Again, I want to follow up because I think that Kevin brings out a really important point, and that is every utility starts off at a different spot and has a different load profile and a different need. And I'm not saying this is how it will be handled in the future, but I know some utilities will look at their price forecast on an hourly basis and compare that to the value in terms of price consumption reduction that will happen with each type of conservation. And from that, they're able to figure out what's cost effective. If you do that, you're going to end up with utility A in Northeast Washington having a very different set of cost-effective resources than utility B in Southwest Washington, and vice versa. That's part of the reason why I'm arguing against a unified standard, because what makes sense in Pend Oreille County won't necessarily make sense in Clark County or Pacific County or Jefferson County or Snohomish County. So it's just very, very difficult to say that a single type of conservation works equally well. And that's why with individual utilities, they can, for them, given their particular circumstances and their expectations for the future, and adopt the appropriate conservation metric and target.
Sorry, let's clarify. Did you say that this would be needing a unified standard?
No, I'm saying
just the opposite, right?
Just the opposite. Well, if I did, that was not intended.
If I can bolster what you're saying, let's talk about conservation, something that we can do very well. Then you have DR and DER. We think we can do DER as well, but DR ends up being a real issue in Grant County, specifically because we have a lot of high energy intensity production processes, and you go to any one of them. Hey, Microsoft, do you mind if I get your temperature, because they have a cooling system, that's their biggest load, right, is cooling. Do you mind if I go ahead and raise the temperature of your cooling system right in the middle of the day? And Microsoft says there isn't enough money anywhere to have us jeopardize the possibility of losing data integrity. So, I mean, you look at the data service centers, we don't want to hear anything about demand response, period. You go to the farmers, the last thing they want is to hear that we're going to be shutting down their pivots right in the middle of the heat, of the hottest part of the day. So, I mean, there are these fundamental processes that just is not very conducive to demand response. And as we've already looked at this, we don't think that there's a lot there. And so if you had a unified policy, we'd be really hard pressed to come up with anything that we could do to compel a response from people who are like, no, it's the most important input in my process. There's no way I'm gonna give you that kind of response. So this is the only one we're worried about where there's a certain amount of compulsion, right? That we have to provide something that will get people to respond. And if they're not willing to respond, then we're kind of stuck.
I want to make sure it's not confused that there's a minimum on each of those three. They're going to be individual by utility. Each utility is going to determine what's their cost-effective energy efficiency, what they can do for renewables, and what they can do for DR. And when we recognize that it's going to change from utility to utility, we didn't establish a minimum.
That's why I was bolstering Nicholas's argument.
Right. So the question would be, in Seattle, if we could do a whole bunch of hot water heaters in residential areas as DR to reduce the demand, that'll probably work really well. It might work in your area too. I don't know, some of the demand. But there may be other things to do in other areas. And so that's but the point was, you need to be specific in your CEIP of what you plan to do. It didn't say you have to do 100 of everything.
So just as a technical point, if you're not in a balancing authority, you won't ever know when you need power. So if you're a customer of BPA and you're in their balancing authority, they may have a really stressed system, but unless they provide some feedback, you're never going to know that the system's stressed. So you'll never have any reason to call on a demand response process or a demand response resource. So I do think you have to think about not only what could technically make sense even economically make sense, unless you can get that, figure out how that signal is going to come back to who's ever running the balancing authority, you'll never trigger it.
And this is Dave Warren.
Is that mostly BPA?
Yeah. Well, to piggyback on that, it seems to me demand response is a function of the system that is used to shave peak. Right. And perhaps we included it in here because the law envisions retiring some thermal peaking capacity over time or intermediate. And so I agree with what Nicholas says, and you can't really, and I would add that there's a sentence in there that demand response may include an increase or decrease of generation on the customer side of the meter in response to incentive payments. So again, that sort of lends itself to the idea of it's providing capacity. That piece, I think, is beneficial to solar. So on behalf of my solar client, but we're not in an organized capacity market. And so how do we value demand response? How do we identify what we need? And it seems to, and not only now shaving peak, but maybe filling in the valleys as well. And that to me is what demand response is. And as we transition over to fewer capacity resources, as we retire some of these thermal resources, it seems to me we might want to all sit around the table and figure out what that market and what the physics of that look like. Because I'm not sure there's really a value proposition in it right now for the reasons Nicholas said and others.
And I just want to finally just sort of build upon what Dave just was saying. Ultimately, if you look at what the Northwest Power and Conservation Council is saying, is that there's going to be a need for demand response. I'm not certain it is not a valuable, important resource. I'm just saying right now we don't have the mechanisms in place to know what its value is or how to trigger in the event of a need. And until we figure that out, the idea that you could have any that meets the cost effectiveness category standard is just nonsensical unless you're your own VA and know internally where your stress points are.
So do you provide anything, Liz, on BPA?
I love the marginal cost.
I actually think, so this is Liz Lefanovel, I think that the market for the demand response and capacity, which we wish there was a market for capacity today, and there isn't yet, and the California market isn't creating it. It's like, just bid and it'll all work out. I think it will evolve over time. So, you know, I think we all keep doing the math right to analyze it, but I think there will be price signals over time. I think as the coal comes off the grid and renewables build, we'll see where there is more generation than when we need it, when there isn't generation when we need it. And so I personally think this will evolve. I don't think we have a very good handle on it today.
So I may offer a few comments about demand response.
No, right.
Not volunteering for anything again.
You're going to regret that.
Yeah. So for demand response programs, the first question is about valuing demand response. So what's that shaved capacity worth? In general, when we look at demand response programs, we're talking about avoided costs. So each utility is going to be special. Each one's going to have their own stream of avoided costs, but that needs to be calculated to be able to value demand response without avoided costs. And that takes account avoided generation capacity, avoided transmission distribution, line losses. So there's a lot of factors that build up this 8760 value stream that's used to value demand response. In terms of how to trigger it, right now it's done with weather forecasts. It has nothing to do with markets. We know that tomorrow the temperature is going to be above 90 for 4 hours in the evening. We trigger a demand response event. And that might happen 10, 15 days throughout summer. If you're a winter peaking utility, it would be something similar. All this to say, demand response is very, very mature, especially in California. So a lot of these problems people have already thought about, and I think we should look at experience in other places for considering it before kind of writing it off for now.
But think about it this way. If you're a full requirements customer of BPA and you get a bill for every megawatt hour that's consumed, whether it's consumed in the morning, middle of the day, nighttime, summer, winter, whatever, and you have to spend any money and all you do is move power from 1 hour to the next, it's not cost effective. Because you're spending money, you're spending more than you otherwise would have for the same amount of power. I think it's valuable. Don't misunderstand this. I'm just saying right now, unless there's a mechanism that there's a feedback, financial and even signal-wise, to tell a utility, okay, things are getting tight or things are getting really loose, we need you to consume power. Until that signal comes back, it's just a guess. You're just making a guess that your action is helping and not harming.
Definitely. Really quickly. So for now, I'd say where you start kind of getting that value right now with localized distribution systems. So you say, okay, I want a value. I don't have capacity market, so how do I assign a value to demand response? Well, you have a substation that needs an upgrade or some sort of transmission line upgrade that you can defer by adding in demand response. So they call these non-wires alternatives. That's where you start getting that value immediately.
So I do,
And I agree with that.
I know this is a really good conversation, but I do want to keep this on track. And I do want to take a minute to kick it to the phones and see if there's anyone that wanted to weigh in on this conversation. If you can unmute real quick. You're unmuted. No, you're not unmuted. I'm lying to you.
I'm unmuted.
You guys are now unmuted. Is there anyone on the phones that wanted to jump in? Okay. Well, it seems clear that a more in-depth conversation around demand response is noted, is really due. So I have made that note on the bike rack as well as on our notes here. So I'm going to put a pause on that.
We did have one question.
Oh, go ahead.
You know, rating the cost effectiveness and response.
Is that a question?
Yeah.
In that case? It sounds like we're doing both simultaneously.
Well, and this is Glenn Blackman. I had a similar thought too, which is that to try to get feedback from you on, you know, this is a topic that does it help to have a standard that's established in the rule so that you know when you've complied with the statute? Or would you rather just leave it between you and your auditor? If there is a rule, then I don't see how differences in cost over geography or time, it's impossible to have a standard. I think there could still be a methodology or a standard that was used. Specific questions for the smaller utilities on energy efficiency or conservation. If it's not the existing one that the larger utilities are using to determine what's available and cost effective and what is an appropriate standard. So those are some questions I'd like to get more feedback on as we move forward over time.
I'd just offer some immediate. You mentioned a standard, it seems to me that if you want to create a standard for demand response for Washington State, you have to do it statutorily, not through a rulemaking, because it currently doesn't exist. And then generally speaking, demand response, I think, again, I'll say it again, we think it's extremely valuable. We've spent years on this in developing projects like that to integrate renewables specifically or for grid modernization. And there's just a lot of confusion over what the value is. And as Liz mentioned, there's not a capacity market. By contrast, where we are with demand response, we all recognize it's valuable. And we're in that kind of nascent phase where we're trying to figure it out versus where we have 30 plus years of energy efficiency and methodologies and mandates. And so I think one of those things that we should not be delving into to set a standard right now is demand response until we have more experience. See how you would do it in the rulemaking without changing.
So, I mean, you're welcome to offer up that sort of legal analysis too.
Yeah.
That's another topic that's on the table.
All right, so yeah, so again, we have note cards. So if there is dangling questions or thoughts, please put them on the note card and we will move on. Okay, so the next conversation is going to be around use of electricity from renewable resources and non-emitting electric generation. Give everyone a minute to write down your thoughts while I look out this chart here. Great. And just a reminder to put which topic number that you're referring to on your note card. That will help us sort through things in the end.
When is there, we would like to do a presentation on time or via phone, send questions or comments.
Yep, that would be great.
Address out.
Yeah, if you can, Austin will copy paste our ceta@commerce.wa.gov email address. So folks in the room too, you think of something later, obviously please email us there. Yeah, if there's comments that we're going through today to add to what's being talked about, send it there. Writing any for non-emitting, like writing it out. All right. So why doesn't Snowpud, you were going to kick us off on this conversation?
Sure. So me and Hunter and Snohomish PUD, I wanted to give a little bit of context around how we kind of got to this point in the CETA process. As the CETA was kind of being drafted, one of the primary concerns of consumer-owned utilities was how to address the variability of hydro generation and to a larger extent renewable resources broadly. But because hydro is such a core component of so many COUs in the state's energy portfolio, we wanted to make sure that because it's so dependent on seasonal weather conditions, that one bad water year wouldn't kick you out of compliance when you've otherwise made the investment in a clean resource to be in compliance with the CETA. And the CETA even goes so far as to say that the legislature wanted to ensure that there were flexible tools in the CETA to make sure that hydro variability was addressed. So a lot of ideas got put forward. We'll do flashback to some of the negotiations about rec banking, deeming a certain amount of hydro generation, regardless of what the actual generation was. Eventually, all the parties kind of agreed upon the multi-year compliance framework that we have in statute now. So that would essentially, the idea behind the multi-year compliance was that utilities or hydro-based utilities, if they have a bad water year, they could cover that with compliance from surplus in a good water year. So you kind of have a little bit of give and take. So from our perspective, when you come to the accounting for compliance with CETA, you're really trying to look at that demonstrating compliance to be reflective of the intent behind the multi-year compliance period. So that when you say you want to use renewable resources, you're saying that that's being accounted for in aggregate across the 4-year compliance period, taking the sum of all your load, sum of all your renewable resources, and those two should equal each other. And the way that, of course, you verify that the renewable resources are used is through the retirement of a REC as commanded in statute. That's kind of where we're coming from and a little bit of context around where the used provisions in the multi-year compliance came from.
The way that you framed it was generation, but that doesn't incorporate, line losses and things like that. And so when you say, I agree with parts of that, but when I'm thinking used, I'm thinking actual delivered energy, not generated energy. And so that's kind of the one clarification.
So I believe Regis does take into account line losses when it's generating RECs versus generation versus what was actually used. So you have line losses kind of accounted for because you only have a megawatt of renewable energy for a megawatt of energy actually received by a utility. The piece with delivery becomes problematic because if we're going with a delivery standard, you're really looking at hour to hour, what's the actual disposition of energy across the system. And what the multi-year compliance tool was implemented to achieve was to say, you may have a bad hydro year, but if you have surplus generation, a good hydro year, that would help you with your compliance obligation. Because if you were limited to the amount of energy that you actually delivered, you could never catch back up. You'd always be limited by the amount of load that you had in that particular year, good hydro year.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what to develop this. To basically to help us with the water risk. The actual compliance is not a problem as long as we're able to deal with the fact that we have this variability.
Well, but that seems like it'd be more of an issue if you're required to meet 100% of your load with 100% actual non-emitting generation, but that seems like less of an issue with when you're only required to meet 80%.
Well, it could be that
you could catch up because
right, but if utilities have a plan established where if their hydro only makes up 80% of their total load over a year, they're planning to meet compliance with either RECs or alternate compliance, say non-cost-effective conservation or energy efficiency. Then a bad hydro year would kick you out and you wouldn't be able to make up the difference with anything else.
Just to give people a kind of perspective, this year was the 12th driest year ever recorded since they've been recording water. So this year in particular, say we're in the 80-20 period, it's flash forward to 2030. If we had this kind of a water year, we would be hard pressed to serve 60% of our load with what we're getting. And so, I mean, it's a real thing, and it happens right now. My concern is with higher variability in the climate due to changing climate, it could actually become even a bigger problem as we go closer and closer to 2045.
I mean, I personally, I agree with that, but it seems like that's something that utilities seem to be planning for no matter what. As we change the climate, climate change is happening, and hydro variability becomes more and more variable. That is something utilities are going to have to plan for regardless of the compliance obligation.
Right. Now, and that was the argument when we were working, you know, to try to put together something that was a bit more collaborative, generally for the state. And so I can remember you making that same argument. The concern we have here is if that ends up being the overall position, then it ends up being a roughly 112 to 115% RPS standard. And I don't think that that's really what was intended here, because we would have to overbuild capacity to that level. And that ends up kind of flying in the face of what the role of hydro has been in the Pacific Northwest, and the fact that, you know, we already are incredibly green. We really need people to honor the fact that it's a variable system. It's no different than variability that you get with wind or variability that you might get with solar. Only the time period it's a bigger scale. Across a day, we're having variability across seasons. It's on par with any other variable energy resource, and that is, I think, one of the biggest characteristics of all renewable energy we're dealing with.
Is there a provision that we could consider that if you fail, but it was due to a critical water use? Well, we're talking about things that are entirely beyond your control, or things that are, you know, a bottom 10th percentile water year, but you would have been even a 25th percentile. Is that reasonable? With the realization that in the interest of really trying to provide environmental contributions, that excess bills of wind and solar and other resources do have an environmental cost.
I'm really glad you point that out. And so what I do for a living is quantitative analytics, and we looked at variability of water, and a 5-year water year was what would give us enough certainty that get us down to about 20% level. So that's why we asked for 5 years, and then the conversations that we had with everyone involved to try to come together with some kind of an agreement that showed that we're kind of working towards the same goal, which is reduction of carbon. He agreed to 4 years, and so that already exposed us to quite a bit more. Now you're at about 28 to 29% level, so we're almost to the point of where we're thinking if you're rolling the dice every single year, we've got about a 1/3% chance of, about a 33% chance of us not making it any one particular year, right? So, any one particular 4-year period. I apologize for that.
But Kevin, to answer your question directly, I think if you'll look into Section 9 where it describes the penalty phase, the penalty applications, there are some what do you want to call them, off-ramps or some exceptions there that do address something similar to what you're talking about. Now, exactly how the rules will flesh that out is yet to be seen. But
the governor has to declare it. It has to be.
Well, that's one of the options. Yeah, there's other options in there.
I mean, we talked about natural disasters, substantial limitations, restrictions. I think there's language in here that if it's really as critical as you're talking about, would probably be
And this is Glenn Blackman, and I'd like to change the hypothetical that we're working with to something that is absolutely predictable. That would be, we had a lot of solar generating resource, enough for a utility that during the day, the generation exceeded load. Is the generation in excess of load at, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, is that a resource that could be used to count toward the 100% standard under Section 4, or isn't it? And, so what's the compliance requirement when you've got resources that don't exactly match up with load? We look at the sum over 4 years of all the renewable and non-emitting generation and compare that to load, or does it actually have to be matched up some sort of a real-time basis? That's what, I'm not sure what the expectation is here.
Lynn, can I take this is Dave Warren. In your example and the other example that the math has been running around bothering me, in your example, if you overgenerate, that excess generation is going to be sold to the wholesale market. Keep the rec for your compliance, that power becomes unspecified and it has a carbon compliance obligation.
Well, it already has because you're selling it into the marketplace generally.
Right, so you either sell it with the rec and therefore you couldn't use it for compliance, right? Or you unbundle the rec and you keep it and bank it for compliance, and then whoever then buys it, assume it's in state, has a compliance obligation, therefore. And the second example is, let's assume your 100% hydro serves your load. Exact, and this is just for mathematical reasons. You have a short water year, you're at 80%. The next year you generate 120%. You're selling that 20% on the wholesale market because you can't put it to load. And I think that your question is, what is use of electricity, right? And how do you, if the intent was to have a 4-year dampening effect, and yet on actual buying and selling in the wholesale market and the RECs and the banking, you can never make up that shortage.
Yeah. Can I make a correction on that example because we are a utility? So if we are selling that excess, I think you have to make a distinction between when you make a resource-specific transaction and you're just selling power. So we do both right now. So if I was making a resource-specific sell where someone else was going to make a claim on my hydros, then I agree I should not be able to use that for compliance. If I'm just selling my surplus in the market, I thought it was very clear in the law that we had a 4-year compliance period where we were aggregating loads over the 4 years and aggregating resources. So if I haven't made a resource-specific sale, that asset, that generation should be available to meet this requirement.
We thought it was clear in the law as well.
Not being double counted, whether it's another program in state or out.
I didn't sell it as specified. I didn't sell it in a resource-specific transaction. That means I'm not transferring a REC.
Right, it's bundled. You said you're selling it specified?
I'm not selling it.
Unspecified, okay, right.
But you'd have to sell it.
So there's other requirements for specified source transactions that I have to provide to my buyer for them to be able to claim it. I'm not providing any of that.
Plus we have to transfer the RECs.
Or retire them because there's not really.
Or sell it into a state without a compliance obligation so that the cost penalty.
And secondly, I want to come back also to Dave. You made the comment that if you sell it as unspecified, then there's all the carbon accounting and things. And I want to go back to the CETA is megawatt hour. It is not a green, I mean, there is a greenhouse gas reporting requirement that got embedded in there. CETA is, to me, an expanded RPS. We're not trying to assign greenhouse gas emissions to unspecified for purposes of compliance and a carbon, specifically within a carbon context.
I do have a question. Melissa, do you distinguish then, I mean, we're talking about 4-year compliance periods, and so there is a big difference to me between how utilities comply between 2030 and 2045 and 2045 and beyond. How do you envision this bundled, unbundled, quasi-unbundled REC in 2045?
I'm going to attack the first compliance period before I think about that, because I think we're dealing with a much different market by then. And so that's not something that I've immediately been concerned about. I see the concern, but
she's retired by then.
think I'm tending to agree with you a little bit, that if you're meeting your EIA compliance, which goes forward, and you can use unbundled recs in that, you could use unbundled recs for the 20%, but the power in between, if you put them on either end, that's going to have to be bundled so that you can count it. If you're selling some part of that somewhere else, you're not going to be able to count it for speed of compliance. And so that's where I think it's a little more direct than making it as complicated as it is.
So I think you start to get into the market impact there and market liquidity. So if we're prevented from selling our surplus into the market because we cannot claim it for CETA, I mean, what?
And I think the distinction there is how you purchase and sell the energy. So we purchase a bundled product and we sell an unspecified megawatt. So when I have that rec, I would be able to claim that it was still bundled because I bought it under a bundled contract, regardless of what happens in the hour-to-hour disposition of energy over the 4-year compliance period. Mm-hmm. Because in the statute, an unbundled rec is defined as a rec that's transacted specifically as unbundled.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So to say from a Climate Solutions perspective, that to me doesn't mean that your customers are using that, or that this question around use is, you know, I'm interested in how you guys sell off the bundled products then versus the unbundled product. But to me, it seems like if you're retaining the rec and selling the solar, or selling the electricity, that there is a question to me around, is that energy actually being delivered to your customers?
How do you deal with the hydro variability issue then? I mean, there's no way to deal with the hydro variability. That's why we went to a 4-year compliance.
Well, to me, I've been thinking about it though, for those utilities, I guess that during a lot of those negotiations, we've been talking about utilities that were at 90%. And so swinging back and forth within the 80 to 100, that the hydro variability allows for that.
The future is that level of variability. I think it might be quite higher.
Yes, all right. I'm with you on that.
I didn't hear that.
The water variability is going to be quite higher. We could easily go into 2-3 years in a row where we're dry, and then we could just have so much water we don't even know what to do with it. Right?
And I think if we get into the hour-to-hour, where did the energy actually flow, becomes very difficult. I think, you know, one of the phrases in the power industry is you can't color code a megawatt. And so trying to distinguish which megawatts or which electrons flowed to which load centers from which generators is pretty much, you have to assemble an army of electrical engineers in order to try and do that. What we're trying to establish here is an accounting mechanism to show that we made an investment in clean energy to serve our load over a 4-year compliance basis.
All right, and with that, I want to just pause for a second and turn to the phone. Austin, can we mute everyone and see if anyone wants to jump in? Definitely unmuted. Does anyone on the phone want to jump in and offer any comments or questions?
Or chop wood while you're listening.
I feel the same way. Okay, and we're going to need to move on. We have about 1 more minute to go ahead and just turn to your note cards, write down any remaining thoughts, questions about this topic, and then we'll move into our last topic of the day before we get to our concluding remarks. Great. All right, so last topic of the day, retirement and tracking of renewable energy credits. So kind of moving along the same theme here. Tacoma Power, yeah, Chris, you want to go ahead and get us started on this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Chris Leverett, Tacoma Power. I want to start by saying I think this topic is incredibly related to what we were just talking about, so I don't see a reason to just kind of cut that discussion off entirely and just talk about Regis, but I would say that, you know, the big questions for us are, you know, to the extent we are sticking with Regis, which, yeah, I think sticking with a system we're all already familiar with and that is used by other jurisdictions is a good idea. There are going to be enough seams issues already between states with other types of clean energy standards that I think starting there is a good spot. I would say is that we cannot separate CETA from EIA going forward in terms, they're linked. We have language that links the two policies. We have compliance options under EIA that are directly tied to actions we would essentially be taking to comply with the CETA. And so because of that, I think that we need to talk a little bit about nomenclature when it comes to the data fields on RECs and Regis and making sure that we're sort of being clear about which RECs would fall under EIA and which ones would fall under just CETA. The reason I bring that up is just because, for example, to take hydro, the difference between an incremental hydro REC and a CETA hydro REC, use the term of art. I guess the other thing I would say is that any accounting mechanism we come up with under, I'll call it topic 5, in terms of use, has to understand the limitations of the system we choose. For example, there's a 90-day delay on RECs showing up after they're generated in Regis. And the way I think of it is a monthly stack that gets deposited. And so, you know, talking about doing some sort of real-time accounting mechanism to me seems like task. So those are kind of some bullet points. Hopefully that's a good discussion starter.
So as you say, too, if you want to hop back in from our previous conversation and pull that over, but any other thoughts on accounting?
Just like one thing really quick, it's a 90-day delay, not an 8-day delay.
Thank you. I thought 8 sounded really weird. Thank you. How many digits delay for RECs to show up? Forget.
Yeah, that's how I understand it, although I want to be clear, I'm not the guy who manages our Regis account.
No, that's correct. Shows up in your accounting system, is that what you're saying? The 90 days?
Yeah, so Melissa, maybe you can say it more artfully, but.
So, yeah, if you submit generation for the month of September, you will not see the RECs on your system for that month. They're not created until January.
And also, within W Regis, you know, there are 2 different kinds of RECs. Just wanted to point that out. One is an incremental REC, and another one is what they call a hydro REC. So
yeah,
we're creating both. And
yeah, I mean, in my mind, so you have a portion of, if I take one of my units at Rocky Reach, I have a portion of that generation that may be eligible under the EIA. And so let's say, you know, of 100 megawatts, 10 of that is going to have the EIA Washington RPS check mark, and then also going to have the CETA check mark. And then the other 90 megawatts for that month going to have only the CETA. So I think you can have certificates that are going to have multiple check marks, and you can have some of them are just going to have one. That's how you'll be able to know what you want to use for compliance, because you are going to have a blended compliance between EIA and the CETA.
Melissa? That was exactly how we were planning on applying with the 4-year compliance period that's in the statute. Is that we have the record already in Regis.
Yep.
And if we're shy, if we don't have enough water 1 year, we can go to that bank that's already in Regis.
So Melissa, if you generate those megawatts in September, submit that, and then it's on the books in January.
I don't have anything to transfer or retire or anything with.
Is the vintage tag from the year with generated?
Maybe September of 2019 in this example.
There's another kind of REC that will be created in CETA, and that's the energy transformation project. Technology is supposed to earn the megawatt hour equivalent of carbon reductions from each investments. So
I wouldn't call it a REC, though. It does not necessarily rule.
It's some kind of equivalent.
It's a credit,
Of
but
some
it's not
sort
a
under
rule.
CETA,
But
but
it
it's compliant.
Dave, are you envisioning that would be an instrument that tracks through Regis? Or?
I don't know. It's a question for some of the people that are more familiar with Regis, but it is a compliant instrument under CETA.
an ecology has to come up with a megawatt hour equivalent in carbon reduction. That's what they need to be.
It's already offset and done. You can't separate attributes. If you're going to use it you're using an you're using an energy transformation project in that 20% starting in 2030.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't separate it from its environmental attribute because you're already using that to establish against, say, a fossil fuel burn.
Yeah, it's a compliance, and it's not tradable. That's right. It can only accrue to the utility that made the investment.
Right.
Right. So however we frame it, it doesn't matter. I just want to give it a shout out that it's another compliance instrument. That's equivalent to a megawatt hour.
It is. I would hesitate to say that would be tracked in Regis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just kind of teeing that up that it is a compliance instrument. It's not tradable, but it is a certificate.
Yeah. And
right.
So I would say it's something other than what we were trying to tee up in this conversation.
That may be fair. Yeah.
So sounds like I haven't heard anybody suggest that a system other than Regis should be forward. Discussion about how RECs are already separated today by fuel type, whether it's legacy, large hydro versus incremental, is consistent with my understanding too. And John's question about vintage, we're taking care of that in the phase 1 EIA rulemaking for the consumer-owned utilities. Sorry, John. And I'm sure the UTC they probably don't even need a rule to fix that. So anyway, are there other REC tracking retirement type issues that that we need to make sure we cover in this?
We have a question. Can you confirm all hydro and WEPC will be eligible to exceed the eligible REC and Regis, whatever tracking system is chosen?
It's whether all hydro and WEC in the Western interconnection can be used. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you. So I'm just going to offer up that I didn't read any geographic constraints on any renewable resource anywhere in the bill. But if I missed it, please highlight it. So I think the answer to that question is yes, but beyond WEC, in theory, I didn't see any geographic boundaries.
I mean,
not the U.S.,
for me,
not.
It gets back to this question about use, and that utility does, I think, need to show that they used it. So that they couldn't just pluck off a sail from point A to B in Arizona and take the REC from that and use it for Washington compliance. But again, I don't really know the details of how that.
So this is John from this. I agree with you. The bill does say that Commerce picks the tracking system. I think the question I was asking, should it be someone from Regis? And Regis strictly tracks WEC. Mm-hmm. So that's the conversation we're having.
Yeah.
The purchase of unbundled, what you're talking about is a purchase of unbundled RECs, correct? Which is the alternative compliance limited to 20%. So I guess I didn't read a restriction to what type of REC you could buy in that case. Are you suggesting that there's another?
No, I wasn't. I didn't have in mind the unbundled REC provisions. It's what we were talking about in the previous topic. That what's required in order to show that electricity was used by the utility.
Yeah, and I think.
And if the electricity was, delivered to load somewhere else, and then to serve that utility's retail customers, it seems like maybe that wouldn't be used under this provision.
So we've discussed our utility prospect of buying
wind recs in Texas, for example. But Regis wouldn't track those or certify them. So we limited this to Regis, then we are regionally constrained away.
Is there authority to do that in the bill?
It is, but that's the conversation we're having.
So one option would be to, for example, choose Regis, but then allow a utility to say, if they want to get a rec someplace else, to set up a process to some sort of opinion from Commerce whether the water from Reggie or someplace else would qualify. I mean, you don't have to, if you pick Regis, doesn't mean you can't accept a different rec.
Is there some reason why we would want Texas recs? I'm not sure about that.
They're cheaper.
They're a lot cheaper.
I wasn't here in 2006 to 8, so I'll let everybody correct me, but part of restricting recs to the West was job creation on renewable projects in the West and in the Pacific Northwest. So I don't know how much impact that went under the EIA. Part of that was there's a region on that for a reason, which was to have projects built and jobs created here. So I get Texas recs on wind are probably pretty cheap, but I guess I would throw out that we assumed that it would be Regis. I understand now why you're bringing this up. I just figured it would still be a regional market we would be looking at rather than a national market. That raises a lot of other questions about verification.
In 937, though, there was a geographic boundary defined in law. Regis was broader than that. And I guess the question is Commerce, by the selection of a tracking system, do they have the legal authority to shrink? In other words, could Commerce say, we're going to pick a tracking system that only credits Washington recs?
And it's not in statute, so I don't see how you would do that.
Right. So I think it's reverse. It's 937 created the geographic boundary. Regis was broader than that, so therefore Commerce wasn't restricting. Now we're reversing it.
Wasn't it also the entity that actually tracked at that time that you could use?
No, I think Regis came into being after 937 passed.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have 2 questions. Great. Well, the first one. Can you use unbundled CETA hydro rec to meet the 20% requirement?
Yes.
All right.
Easiest one today.
One member has wondered if very small hydro projects that haven't been registered in this could possibly be tracked through a different system, or would the expectation be that all renewable resources be tracked in one system, regardless of size?
Similar question, I think, what we're, but just a more different angle on it. So geographic constraints, things that aren't registered with Regis.
Yeah, would you like to read it again?
No, that's fine. Regis has some very small generating facilities in the system already today, and so I guess I would like to have an understanding about why a small hydro project couldn't be tracked.
Yeah, 3 meg, not a problem. 3 average meg, not a problem for them.
Yeah, I mean, we've got.
I just know that from.
We've got small solar projects that are in there already today.
I don't know if this conversation's over. I was gonna.
Well, I had a follow-up for Glenn, because you had asked a really good question about how, I don't understand how power flowing in Nevada could be seen as energy used. And you're really touching upon something that I don't know that we spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the inevitable market transformation that we're going through. After you get done with EDAM, you go into exactly what California has right now, which is a fully integrated 2-settlement market. And doing those kinds of transactions, it's exactly what we're looking for. If our true goal here is to reduce carbon, I want to have the ability to actually get power from Arizona delivered here. I don't want to have a lot of market pancaking of transmission costs that prevent me from doing that. So the rest of the United States has these kind of markets already in place, and so being able to do deals in the panhandle of Texas and deliver up to North Dakota is absolutely doable, not a problem. And you can have a contract in place. Those are your electrons, and it's actually the ISO that's responsible for making that delivery happen. So that is exactly the world we're looking for, and everyone in this room should be looking for that. If we have the common goal of, hey, we want that Arizona solar. They have the best solar in the world. Why wouldn't we? I mean, I absolutely want that, and I'm hoping in 5 years we get that.
This may be a topic that the markets work group will cover off later this week. But in the context of the objective of preventing double counting, I think the selection of the tracking system and the methodologies used to track is going to be critical as well. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well as the discussion goes forward with the market work group.
That was exactly what I was going to bring up. So thank you. I love that. Utility brought it up and not me, but double counting is something that we haven't talked a lot about here today, and I think another big issue that deserves more than the 5 more minutes that we have.
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate what has been said a few minutes ago. I think it's important to allow utilities as much flexibility as possible in buying RECs from wherever they can for the least amount of money. There isn't, to me, we keep hearing how climate change is a global issue. Well, if you can reduce a megawatt hour of coal in Utah or in Arizona or in Soviet,
careful.
You have
Soviets, yeah, be hard to track.
You had an effect on the global climate, so I don't see how it matters. Now, I do think that it's clear that Commerce needs to pick a tracking system, but it doesn't. You could pick 2, or you could make arrangements for someone who wants to go outside of the Regis footprint to be able to do that. So I have no problem with Regis. I think it works well. I think it's effective, but I don't see why, from a public policy perspective, specifically when the legislature didn't see fit to limit it, why Commerce should see fit to try to limit it. Because, that's something that, quite frankly, could end up being disputed.
Right?
What?
For the bundled power and REC, they're going to buy bundled solar power and the REC from Arizona. That's what you're saying.
No, the 20%, you can be unbundled.
20%, yeah.
Well, yeah, the bundle part, I'm not arguing about that. I'm talking about the...
Okay.
Well, and just one thing I'll say is that a couple of you have brought up, most cost-effective carbon reduction. I mean, there's a reason that Texas RECs are really cheap, because wind is the cheapest resource. So I don't necessarily think that purchasing a REC from Texas is the situation. I don't necessarily have a very strong opinion on whether or not we limit it to Regis or not, but I do just want to say that the intent is actually getting us to 100% clean energy, which means the more local, the closest we are as a region to getting to 100% clean. So,
this is Tom from Clark. I think it was a trade-off. I mean, we do social cost of carbon, which is based upon a global perspective, and the RECs, on the 20% that we may or may not use to be carbon neutral, ought to reflect that as well. And I'm not saying we go to Russia to get our RECs, but I'm saying it should give us the ability to be more of a footprint than just the West Coast.
Can I add one last thing too? You had mentioned it in the email before about the Regis fees, and so they're very, very small, but when you're paying fees on 10% of your generation, you're going to be going to 100%. I think it probably deserves more of a conversation, because we're reporting all the same information right now. There's no real additional work that they're going to have to do. Our units are all registered and everything, but what they're going to get revenue-wise and as a collective group is going to go up a lot. So it's like a half a cent. But still, I mean, you're talking about, probably 10 times.
10 million megawatt hours.
So just a
for the group to consider.
This may be why I got an email morning from just saying they weren't going to be able to be at the meeting today. But they're on the phone, and so they are monitoring this. I also think they can help us a little bit on this question about geographic scope, because there are some provisions for transfer of rec between tracking systems. So even if we pick Regis, we may not be limiting ourselves to particular geography. We're just going to have to learn more about that, I think. But I agree with you, Melissa, about that conversation.
Just quickly on the bike rack, excuse me, rather than parking lot, is an electric bike rack or human powered bike rack. But could we also add racks from storage to the double counting and maybe go to another conversation? I think racks come and go through a storage cycling. Thank you.
All right, do you want to pause before we end here to check in on the phone?
Well, before we go to the phone, we have one question. So can you confirm that there will be an accounting certificate that is like a REC for all non-emitting energy used for CETA compliance 2030 onwards?
No, I don't think we have that figured out yet. You know, what the demonstration of compliance would be. May not be a certificate like a REC. It may be a thick folder of contracts, attestations, something like that. So I'm not sure.
Can I ask a follow-on question as I'm thinking about Regis relative to Texas RECs and some of the other things? The end game is that unbundled RECs are to help reduce global carbon emissions. Why would we not want the broadest area? Theoretically, if you allow people to buy cheaper RECs, you create a greater demand for those RECs that are cheaper, and in turn, incent people to build more generation that will produce those RECs. Wouldn't using a broader base area, even if it's Texas wind RECs, incent people at the end of the day to produce more Texas wind RECs that would reduce carbon emissions globally? Job creation benefits to using Regis, but the question is and thinking about some of the larger social issues that we discussed earlier, is there that much incremental benefit to saying a REC generated in Arizona counts, but one in Mississippi? You know, objectively, one of the poorest states in the nation shouldn't count.
And I would take that argument one step further. When a REC from an Idaho Purple project counts, and that has nothing to do with job creation or anything else, because PURPA drove that project, right? The REC was created in the various state laws that purchased the REC. Has nothing to do with what drove projects to get developed. So
I know a lot about Texas, and it's kind of funny. One thing I do know about Texas is that they don't have a mandatory 2025 no coal in your rates on the books anywhere. But they do say build as much wind as possible, right, and take advantage of that. I mean, they're supporting that. They're building a lot of the infrastructure necessary to get that delivered. So when you talk about some of the dirtiest, we're talking some of the nastiest coal plants in existence that are in Texas, they're starting to shut down. And they're doing it naturally, right, because, you know, they have so much wind production in the state. So ultimately, I would think that from a public policy perspective, if we can't get their laws to change, we certainly can appeal to their better interests in terms of investing in their wind. So it's a way of, I mean, I'm buying the argument 100%, right? They would love to have us going down there and saying, hey, I don't really care what you do with your electricity. We want the REC.
I think that's the definition of a free market.
It's a definition of what happens when you have states that don't play well. They're not buying into what we want them to do, but we can buy into what they want to do and appeal to their interests, their financial interests. That's exactly how we got wind built in Kansas. So we couldn't get it pushed through the Republican-dominated legislature. until it became clear that there was enough interest in land and that we were willing to actually increase our rents for people who were wanting to have these wind farms put on their property, right? And all of a sudden the laws changed. We're appealing to their better interests. So I'm absolutely in agreement. The worst thing we could possibly do is make this a parochial issue and only build in areas that are close by. You have a land rush for all the best sites, and you're assuming you're basically going to guarantee you'll be paying the highest price possible for your wind production. And you could go, to Wyoming, get more consistent wind, better quality wind, and that's more predictable, delivered to the system.
So the other benefit of buying a Texas REC is you're paying a tribute to the creator of RECs. Pat Wood and the Texas Public Utility Commission created the concept of a tradable renewable energy certificate in 1998 or 9. So there you go.
It's an effective way of encouraging good public policy. That's really.
Yeah. So Glenn, did you? Oh, okay. So I think that's about all we have time for on this. Thank you, everyone, for engaging. Go ahead and just take a minute, write down those remaining thoughts, either this or any of the other topics you see here, and then we'll do some wrap-up and concluding remarks. But I'll give everyone just a minute to kind of. No, Nicholas, yeah.
Are you going to summarize them?
Are you offering? Yes, we will put out some kind of summary. Glenn's been, kind of providing some context for the kind of comments that he wants to get back for the next round. Glenn, do you want to say something about that, or?
Well, everyone have to finish their note cards first.
So finish your note cards. We will provide a summary of this. Obviously, feel free to take pictures. Probably my writing is not the best to be publicly posted on Commerce's website, but yeah, we will get some for you.
Still have the opportunity to send written comments on the
Yes, and we're going to talk about the timeline for that during wrap-up.
We got a win for that. Let's wrap up right now.
No, we never thought that.
See, how's your people?
Something that I keep back to my
Make them 65% built. Very high quality.
And if you want to pass your comment cards my way, and a reminder for housekeeping on the phone, if you want to email your comments that are just notes from the day, not your official public comments or anything, feel free to do so at PETA@commerce.wa.gov. You can call on a personal cell phone.
Oh, really? Coming in here.
These people asking them to cut the chicken.
Not a very big.
All right, so we don't drift too far. We can get you all out of here on time. We're going to have Glenn just do some wrap-up comments. Wrap. Oh, I didn't tell you Glenn was doing a wrap. Now you're paying attention.
Get my notebook out.
So Glenn's going to do some wrap-up comments and conclude remarks. Glenn, take it away.
All right. Well, first I want to thank everybody for engaging. This to me was really constructive to have everybody able to participate together, listen to each other's comments, and I just really thank you all for the constructive approach that you took to it. I think maybe we can all leave here feeling like we've done a good job of sorting out some of these issues, or at least figuring out what we need to do in order to sort them out. So thank you for that. I did want to check in with you about whether you feel like on these particular issues, you've got kind of enough of each other's views on this that you feel comfortable with doing written comments on these topics. So, what kind of timeline might be helpful? Not so far out that you forget what talked about, but not so close that it jams you up against something else. So do people feel like written comments would be a good next step on these topics? And if so, how long should we say for getting those in?
For October 30th?
October 30th is to get comments following the workshop on planning. Okay. And I thought I would talk about that a little bit later.
Okay.
But I'm certainly not asking you to these points in your October 30th comments. I think that's
maybe it should be done though before November. We wanted to address these issues before we get into another set of issues on November 14th or next one, or is it over 16th or whatever?
November 4th.
4th.
Well,
no, there's another one after.
Low income.
Right.
Workshop around section 12.
I was thinking actually something that
you're right. There's
like
one. I think it's November 15th. Maybe it's a mid-November date.
On the website, yeah. UTC has come to the board.
Yeah. So we could look for written comments before that mid-November workshop date, if that seemed reasonable. Is that too soon to? Yes. We could look at the end of November.
Before Thanksgiving.
Before Thanksgiving. Oh, how about that?
Before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
And just for process, these would then inform the potentially written rules that you would then send out a draft. You'd use these comments to create a draft and then it all.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because we're looking at all of next year to get this work done, so we're not going to jump to conclusion on these, in the first quarter of 2020, for example.
I guess there's one thing, and maybe I'm just me, I'm a little stuck on, if you have comments, say for Thanksgiving, and maybe these comments plus anything discussed in the mid-November date or not. I mean, that's the part that I kind of like taking it in smaller bites. But
and it sounds like you don't like this sort of overlapping thing. And
I just want to file everything.
Right. So I've been thinking that the November workshop, we might pick up kind of the reporting issues. Originally, I thought, well, reporting plus compliance all in Wenatchee, and that turned out to be way too much. So, I mean, I think we could find another set of topics that aren't these anyway to talk about in November and allow for this overlapping process that doesn't confuse us too much. That's an idea. I don't know. There are other ideas, but I'm open to that too.
You have a 4-year compensation window.
Yeah, right. What you should have said 4 years ago. I'd love that, actually.
I like the banker.
Just writing down what I have without
if you had kind of some key takeaways, key points from this workshop, maybe throw out some questions or say, hey, this is what I heard. And so, kind of a discussion comment that frame our comments or something that you really need help for. I think that would be helpful for us rather than figuring out, well, we talked about a lot of stuff today. So what are we as our overall groups or individual utilities for the comments? So it just be helpful to actually frame that.
Any other thoughts on that? Looks like maybe Liz has a thought.
Yeah, temporal. Are there topics that I feel like we talked about this some months ago, but maybe a refresher on, are there some topics that you think are worth doing later or clarity, maybe, that, you know, it's talking about the 2030 standard and maybe we don't need to write the rule in 2020 or 2021. Maybe we do, but maybe we don't. And maybe there are some topics that fit that. But that would have value to get us to focus on the things that drive possibly investments or analysis. Now, I can't swear that I'm coming up with my list of what those would be, but it just occurs to me that some things always seem like a bigger near-term priority than others.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely
So I'll think about
focus more on the 2030 standard than I do on the 2045 standard in my own thought about it. But I also am working under a statute that says we need to conclude this rulemaking by the end of 2020.
We need to conclude a.
I read it differently than that.
I mean, it's not like, you also have the authority to go in. Right?
Yeah. And I think one thought behind that was that investment decisions happen well before 2030. So, anyway, were there other reactions to Steve's suggestion about, you know, is it too directive for me to put out some kind of reaction document before you have written comments, or is it helpful for me to do that?
Helpful, I think. This is Nicholas with Wakuda. I just want to reiterate, my mind wandered for a little bit, so this may have already been said, but and I think Liz hit on it. Having some clarity on things that you've done, probably don't need to deal with this immediately, would be the most helpful, because then we could focus on stuff that are going to be dealt with. So to me, that would be the most helpful thing, is just knowing where you're thinking, maybe you can wait.
Okay, yeah, I mean, and I'm also, you know, the door is open for comments about that, you know, so.
But if I say, oh, you know, you should wait on this, and then you say, no, you shouldn't, then do I lose my opportunity to say, well, if you're going to do it, then you need to think of it this way. Right. You know, it just allows you to not, otherwise you say, don't do it otherwise, but if you are, then it just ends up getting a lot more involved.
But again, I do like their idea. I do like the idea of moving out sort of what you thought, because, you know, we'll be glad to tell you when you're wrong.
I've seen that, yeah.
I think that sounds like a good thing to, with before or after Thanksgiving, generally speaking, be better. It's a good just first approximation to get in the room right now. I heard before Thanksgiving. Can I show hands? Before Thanksgiving would be better for comments.
Yeah,
In response to the things we talked about today, where Glenn will send out a kind of more directed inquiry about what we're looking for in terms of.
Good try.
Okay, so it looks like, and then is there anyone that is like, definitely needs to be after Thanksgiving? No, okay. That's helpful just to get us.
For me, it depends on when you get your summary out, because I'll send it out to my members.
So I'll try to do that. I don't know exactly, but I'll try to be.
Tomorrow by 8 a.m.
And that's the other thing. And I know you're working in conjunction with some of these other work groups with UTC, and we have the markets work group that's meeting here shortly. Are there any products that you need to get out the door or need some finality on that other things and later on in the process are dependent upon? So again, going back to that prioritization, like, you know, we need to get the social cost of carbon emission and process out there. What other items are short-term that are required in order to build your other portions of your rulemaking?
Yeah, and at this point, it seems like we kind of need to talk about everything before we get specific about anything. But I do feel like we're getting closer to that point. So some of these things, you know, like that we've talked about today, it seems like we have maybe the opportunity to knock them off and set them aside and say, we're done with that. Let's go on and do something else.
I think the more definition and more clarity you can get on each individual piece is going to reduce the collective anxiety of this entire group, such as defining what's equitable.
Yeah, and the planning, I think we have a lot of work in front of us in terms of writing rules around the planning statutes 6 and 14, and that a lot, but we can't really reach a final decision on some of the other things until we've done that work. So I envision that none of this is going to get real settled until sometime in the fall of 2020. So.
Well, something along that, I mean, I guess just thinking about this prioritization, it seems like there were so many complaints things that come up today that are very dependent on how the planning will shape out. And so I am wondering, it seems like it would still be helpful for you to have comments, but it does feel like this is more, this has to all happen after a lot of this.
I think, you know,
kind of trying to delay that.
I know. Well, I mean, the other side of that is that you don't know how to do your planning unless you know what it is you're required to do. So, and they're both true, I think. So.
All right. Well, if there's any other final things, send us an email. Thank you, everyone, for being really attentive and bringing along a conversation today. And have a good, safe drive wherever you're going.
Yep. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. You know?
That's right. He went over to me.
You're going to try to record all of that?
Oh, yeah. And then if you have comment cards, pass them this way.
I know Glenn was taking detailed notes. I know you guys did great. Man, try to figure it out.